Kristen Rossum was born on October 25, 1976, into a very affluent family. Her father, Ralph Rossum, was a professor at Azusa Pacific University, where he taught constitutional law, and her mother, Constance Rossum, also worked there. Christine was the eldest child and had two brothers, Brand and Piers. They lived in Claremont, California, USA. Christine was highly talented, attending a children's modeling agency and professionally training in ballet and dance. However, a serious ankle injury that tore her ligaments forced Kristen to abandon her dream of becoming a professional dancer. The medical diagnosis was a devastating blow for her, as it meant her ankle joint would never fully recover its mobility, which was a huge tragedy for Kristen, from which she took a long time to recover. In 1991, her father assumed the presidency of Hampton-Sydney College, and the family relocated to Virginia. Christine enrolled in an all-girls school in Richmond, where she began using alcohol, smoking marijuana, and later turned to using methamphetamine. Her parents were not pleased when they found out about her addiction and tried various ways to divert her from these destructive habits. Their relationship with their daughter became seriously strained during this time. They argued, locked her at home, withdrew financial support, and even had to involve the police on occasion. Christine's parents made incredible efforts to help their daughter overcome her addiction and return to a normal life. And finally, in 1994, she succeeded. Christine got a job at the University of Redlands, and it seemed like her life was getting back on track. However, in 1995, she had a nervous breakdown, quit her job, and relapsed into substance abuse. Ultimately, she attempted to take her own life, but thanks to medical intervention, her attempt was unsuccessful, and she was saved. To try to divert her from the negative path she was on, her parents sent Kristen to travel to the city of Tijuana on the border of Mexico and the United States, where she crossed paths with 22-year-old student Gregory de Villers, who was also traveling there with his brothers at the time. An instant attraction developed between Christine and Gregory, which quickly blossomed into true love at first sight. After spending several days together, they decided to start dating upon returning home. Kristen and Greg grew close very quickly, with Kristen openly sharing her struggles with depression and the addiction she had not yet fully overcome. Greg understood that Kristen's involvement with illicit substances could harm their relationship, but his feelings for Kristen were so strong that he promised to support her through this challenge. He cared for her, putting incredible effort into helping her overcome her destructive habit. In the end, Greg's efforts were not in vain, and thanks to his unwavering support, Christine managed to overcome her addiction and completely break free from everything that had been detrimental to her health and well-being, an achievement that had seemed impossible not long ago. With Greg and her family's support, Kristen enrolled in San Diego State University and graduated with honors in 1998, leading her to secure a position as a toxicologist in the San Diego County Medical Examiner's Office. By that time, Greg had already completed his university education and worked for several years in an analytical agency. On June 5, 1999, the couple tied the knot and celebrated a lavish wedding. Gregory and Kristen's marriage lasted just over a year and a half, and initially, everything was more than wonderful. They were both young and happy. However, on one ordinary day, Greg was found unconscious in their bedroom, creating a perplexing scene for the paramedics and the police. Gregory was discovered unconscious on the bedroom floor amidst rose petals. A wedding photograph lay near the pillow, and crumpled pages from his wife Kristen's diary were found scattered on the floor. The police immediately found this whole scenario eerily reminiscent of a scene from the movie American Beauty. Gregory was quickly rushed to the hospital, where medical professionals declared him deceased upon arrival. Christine immediately made an official statement to the authorities, claiming that her husband had taken his own life. She told detectives that on the previous day he had been deeply upset and depressed, had consumed a significant amount of alcohol, and had taken powerful antidepressants. The San Diego police did not rush to investigate, primarily because everything appeared to be fairly straightforward, and they did not want to get involved with Kristen's family. Greg's family was shocked by his death and refused to believe that their son could commit such an impulsive act. He was a lively, successful, young, and healthy individual who had no history of substance abuse. One of Greg's brothers, Jerome, was convinced that something was amiss and suspected that Kristen might somehow be involved in his brother's death. Jerome had his reasons for distrusting Christine. He shared an incident that occurred when all three of them were students. Greg and Jerome shared an apartment during their university days, and when Kristen entered Greg's life, she moved into the apartment with them. For a while, everything seemed fine. They coexisted peacefully. However, at some point, Jerome noticed that various items, cash, and checks were mysteriously disappearing. Naturally, suspicions fell on Kristen, and despite her denials, the missing items were found in one of her purses. This led to a serious rift between the brothers, and Jerome was forced to leave the apartment. Unlike his brother, Jerome never truly believed in Kristen, considering her a pathological liar and a manipulator of emotions. Based on his suspicions, Jerome regularly contacted the police and requested a reinvestigation into the mysterious death of his brother, Gregory de Villers. In the end, investigators found Jerome's arguments not entirely baseless and decided to reopen the case. Due to the potential conflict of interest, investigators sent the initial autopsy results of Gregory de Villers to an independent laboratory located in Los Angeles. During the subsequent laboratory examinations, a lethal dose of fentanyl was found in the young man's body, exceeding the permissible limit by 7 times. The police were deeply perplexed by this fact, particularly considering that the initial autopsy and forensic examination had been conducted in a laboratory where Christine's spouse worked, and nothing suspicious had been discovered during the autopsy. Furthermore, the fact that the person responsible for the autopsy was none other than Michael Robertson, the immediate superior of Christine, also piqued the interest of law enforcement. Investigators also requested recordings of conversations between Kristen and the emergency room doctor and interviewed the police officer present at the scene after discovering the body and at the hospital where Greg was taken. The police officer claimed to have witnessed Christine being visited by a man whom she embraced, and it turned out to be none other than Michael Robertson. Continuing their investigation, detectives uncovered the following. Michael Robertson, of Australian origin, had recently been hired in the forensic medicine department as Kristen's boss. Despite the fact that the young woman had just gotten married, an extramarital relationship quickly developed between her and her boss, which went beyond professional boundaries. This was happening in plain view of their colleagues, and it seemed that only her spouse was unaware of it. Furthermore, investigators discovered that Christine had resumed using illicit substances, to which she now had unrestricted access due to her responsibilities, which included registering confiscated substances stored in their laboratory. Upon learning about his lover's destructive addiction, Michael Robertson not only failed to intervene, as proper procedure required in such cases, but also chose to cover for her by falsifying certain documents. After the police uncovered these facts, they decided to conduct searches in the offices of Christine and Michael. They discovered that the couple had recently participated in a conference where they presented research, sponsored by their employer, discussing fentanyl research and its effects on the human body. 1 month after Gregory's death, Rossum and Robertson were fired from the medical examiner's office. She for concealing her methamphetamine addiction, and he for enabling her drug use and engaging in a sexual relationship with a subordinate. Step by step, the police pieced together the events, gathering more and more evidence in favor of Kristen's culpability in her husband's death. In June 2001, 7 months after his death, Kristen Rossum was arrested and charged with premeditated murder. During interrogations, she recounted her version of the events leading up to her husband's death. Greg discovered his wife's affair with her boss entirely by chance when he found a love letter that had fallen from her purse. A serious argument erupted between the spouses, and in his anger, Greg threatened to expose the truth to her employer and her parents, among other things. This was the turning point in the decision to physically eliminate her husband. Kristen was aware that the consequences of this case becoming public could be catastrophic for her and her lover. Besides the risk of losing their jobs, they could face criminal charges. Since the argument between the couple occurred late in the evening, Kristen suggested postponing their discussion until the morning. The following day, waking up next to her husband, Kristen realized he didn't look well. Therefore, she offered him a headache and depression pill. After some time, Greg's condition not only failed to improve but worsened. He experienced dizziness and was on the verge of losing consciousness. Taking matters into her own hands, Kristen sent a text message to her husband's boss, apologizing for him and stating that her spouse couldn't come to work that day due to feeling unwell. She then left for work herself. During her lunch break, Kristen returned home supposedly to have lunch with her husband. Seeing that he hadn't improved, she left Greg home alone again and returned to her office. When she finished work and left the office at 5:00 p.m., Kristen decided to go shopping. Upon returning home around 7:30 p.m., she found her husband asleep, presumably still under the influence of the antidepressants he had taken earlier in the day. She went to take a bath, and at around 9:00 p.m., Kristen found herself in bed next to her husband. At that moment, she realized that her husband wasn't breathing. His complete lack of response caused panic, and suspecting that her husband was unconscious due to an apparent overdose of sleeping pills, she called the emergency services. On January 4, 2002, Kristen's parents posted a bail of $1, $25 million for her, and took her out of the pretrial detention facility. While the investigation was ongoing, the young woman remained free. The trial began in late 2002. The prosecution claimed that Kristen Rossum intentionally killed her husband to prevent him from revealing to her superiors that she was having an affair with the chief toxicologist, Robertson, and that she was using methamphetamine that she stole from the laboratory. In contrast, the defense attorneys argued that Greg was prone to suicide and had poisoned himself. Detectives presented compelling evidence that the young woman had acted deliberately and with cold calculation. According to eyewitness accounts on the day of Greg's death, Kristen was observed having a lengthy conversation with Michael Robertson. Additionally, when she went shopping, she intentionally paid in cash to avoid leaving a trace of her purchases without a cash receipt or surveillance camera footage. However, she made a small oversight. Before paying for her purchases, she presented her Vons store loyalty card, and the system automatically recorded a list of her selected items during the order process. Among other things on this list was a red rose. Investigators also discovered that shortly before her husband's death, Kristen had signed an agreement to donate his organs, and at the same time, she was preparing for his cremation. Such promptness in her actions raised significant suspicions with the investigators, as it was evident that she was trying to cover her tracks in the crime. On November 12, 2002, Kristen Rossum was found guilty of first-degree murder by a jury, and on December 12, she was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole and fined $10,000. She was sent to the Women's Institution of Central California in Chowchilla, the largest women's correctional facility in the USA. Michael Robertson, after being fired from the medical examiner's office, returned to Australia. He was named as a co-conspirator during Rossum's trial, but as of 2012, he had not been extradited to the United States to face charges in Greg de Villers' murder. In 2006, Greg de Villers' family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Kristen. On March 25, 2006, a San Diego jury ordered her to pay punitive damages in excess of $100 million. The family's attorney stated that they might never see this money, but it was done to prevent Kristen from profiting from her crime, as she intended to sell the rights to make a movie and write a book about her story. Greg's parents never fully recovered for the loss of their son. They were shocked by the cynicism with which the young man had been killed. He was very kind to Kristen, loved her, supported her, and believed in her. However, due to her troubled psyche, she failed to appreciate this and chose to turn to the dark side of her destructive addiction. Instead of addressing the problems in their marriage and opting for a divorce, she decided to poison her husband. Interestingly, Kristen showed no remorse for her crime. She blamed everything on Greg, saying that he smothered her with his love and did not give her the freedom she so desperately needed. During the trial, she behaved like a television star, drawing the attention of reporters. While cameras were not allowed in the courtroom during the actual trial, they closely followed her fashionable entrances and exits. Kristen repeatedly attempted to file appeals claiming the unfairness of her sentence, but each time, she received a denial. On September 3, 2011, the U.S. Court of Appeals issued a final rejection. Stephanie Bennett was born on August 30, 1979, in the small American town of Rocky Mount, Virginia. When she was little, her parents divorced, and Stephanie stayed with her mother. However, their father lived near their home, and the young woman continued to see him almost every day. Later, her father remarried, and Stephanie gained a stepsister named Diana. After school, Stephanie enrolled in Roanoke College, located 350 kilometers from her home. In her final year, she met a guy named Walter, and they soon started dating. After college, the couple moved to different cities, but they continued to be together. Stephanie moved to the city of Raleigh, North Carolina, with her stepsister Diana and their mutual friend Emily. The three of them rented an apartment in the Bridgeport residential complex, located in a quiet, peaceful area on the outskirts of the city. The young woman found a job at IBM, while her boyfriend moved to Greenville, South Carolina, to obtain an engineering degree. Stephanie lived in Raleigh for about a year. By that time, she and her sister and friend were planning to move to different cities. The young woman, who was only 23 at the time, was planning to move to Greenville to be with her boyfriend, and the couple had already begun looking for a place to rent. In May, Stephanie went to Greenville, where she and Walter looked at several apartments and chose a suitable option for rent. When she returned to Raleigh, her friends and sister were no longer in the apartment. Emily had moved to another city, and Diana had gone away for a few days to attend a funeral. On the evening of May 20th, Stephanie came home from work and spoke to Walter on the phone. Her boyfriend was planning to send her a rental agreement via fax for her to sign. They agreed that he would send it the next day when she could use her work computer. The following day, Walter tried to reach her, but Stephanie didn't answer either her work or home phone. He then called her sister Diana, who contacted Stephanie's colleagues. It turned out that Stephanie didn't show up to work that day, which was very unusual. Stephanie was always responsible and would have informed her boss if she was sick. Moreover, if she was at home sick, she would have answered the phone. Diana asked her friend to go to their apartment and check if everything was okay. There was no answer when they knocked on the door. Then Diana asked the apartment manager to open the door with a spare key. As soon as the man entered the apartment, he saw a horrifying sight. Stephanie was lying lifeless on the floor of the room, with no clothes on and bruises on her neck. The manager immediately called the police. Detectives found Stephanie's documents and confirmed that the deceased was indeed her through a photo. On the laundry basket cover, which was under the window in Emily's bedroom, investigators noticed leaves and concluded that the killer may have entered the apartment through the window. They also discovered that the home phone was in the closet in Emily's room and the cable was cut. Apparently, the perpetrator was hiding there and took the phone with him, so Stephanie couldn't use it. After speaking with Diana, the police determined that several items were missing from the apartment. The perpetrator took $8 from Stephanie's wallet, 2 tape recorders, and the laundry basket from Stephanie's room. It seemed that he had put the stolen items inside the basket. Experts found semen on the victim's body and extracted a DNA sample, but it wasn't in the FBI database. They also determined that the cause of death was strangulation. Interestingly, the perpetrator took the object he used to kill the victim with, as the police were unable to find it in the apartment. Meanwhile, investigators interviewed all the residents of the complex, hoping someone might have seen the killer. During these conversations, the police learned that something strange had been happening in the residential complex for several months. People regularly noticed someone peeping at them through the windows of their apartments. They complained to the manager, but the management of the complex could not find the person. Interestingly, at least once this person was seen at Stephanie's window. In addition, several months ago, an unknown man near the lake near the complex assaulted a young woman who went for a run. After this incident, Stephanie was afraid to stay alone in this apartment and wanted to move to Greenville as soon as possible. Detectives studied the area around the complex and discovered something strange. In the bushes, they found dozens of pieces of women's underwear, which, as later turned out, belonged to Stephanie. The police thought the killer took them out of the apartment, but then, for some reason, threw them in the bushes. However, soon this version was refuted. It turned out that a teenager living in the neighboring apartment regularly sneaked into Stephanie's room and stole her underwear, after which he threw it into the bushes. He admitted this when investigators questioned all the residents, but he denied his involvement in the murder. His DNA sample was taken, and it did not match the sample obtained from the killer's semen. For this reason, he was no longer suspected of the crime. The police believe that the most obvious candidate for the role of the killer was the same man who repeatedly peeped at the female residents of the complex through the windows. After talking to everyone who had ever noticed this person, the detectives compiled an approximate portrait. It was published in newspapers, but it did not yield any results. As part of the standard procedure, investigators checked the victim's boyfriend. He voluntarily gave his DNA, which did not match the killer's sample. In addition, at the time of the murder, Walter was hundreds of kilometers away from her home and physically could not have been there. After that, the police went to all the male residents of the complex, asking them to voluntarily give their DNA. This also did not yield any results. The experts did not find a single match among the 283 samples obtained. At this point, they did not have any serious leads. Detectives organized surveillance of the residential complex, hoping to catch the man who was spying on the residents. To their surprise, they quickly succeeded. On June 3rd, the police noticed a man who approached several windows on the ground floor and peered into the apartments. Stopping at one of the windows, this person began to satisfy himself, and the police immediately arrested him. This pervert turned out to be Christopher Lee Campen, who had been caught spying several times before and had been convicted of stalking a woman 3 years earlier. The detectives thought they had finally caught the killer, but they were disappointed. Christopher's DNA did not match the sample found on the victim's body. He was charged with spying, but they stopped considering him a suspect in the murder case. Since then, the police continued to work on the case, but they had no substantial leads. A year later, the lead detective heard about a lab in Florida that could determine a person's ethnicity based on their DNA. However, he had doubts about this technology, but he didn't want to miss such an opportunity. As a test, he sent the DNA of 4 of his colleagues of different ethnicities to the lab. The experts succeeded in their task, 100%, and the detective sent them the DNA of Stephanie's killer. The lab determined that the DNA belonged to a white person, but this information did not help the police much. In August 2003, the victim's father offered a reward of $100,000 for any information that would lead to the capture of the killer. Her mother wrote a letter which was published in local newspapers, begging people to share with the police any information that could help identify the suspect. All of this brought some new leads, but they did not lead anywhere. In April 2004, based on the testimony of multiple witnesses, detectives decided to interview all residents of the complex again. They suspected that the man arrested for voyeurism might not have been the only one who walked around the complex buildings and peeked into other people's windows. Knowing the identity of the first man and having his photographs, the investigators wanted to talk to the residents who had seen the voyeur again. Unfortunately, none of them had ever seen his face. Most often, this man appeared at night, and he almost always wore a hood. However, some witnesses said they saw him without the hood, but could only see that he had long hair. Detectives interviewed several dozen people until they finally reached the man who saw this person right in front of Stephanie's window before her murder. His testimony was already with the police, but this time he remembered something else. The witness claimed that he saw this person a few days after the incident during daylight hours. This man was walking his dog near the wooded area behind the residential complex, and the witness recognized him by his hoodie. He watched him for a while until he disappeared behind the trees with his Labrador. Apparently, the witness simply forgot about this incident or did not think it was related to the murder, so during the initial questioning, the police did not receive this information. One thing is for sure, detectives only obtained this information 2 years after Stephanie's death. Now they knew they should be looking for a man with a Labrador. Judging by the fact that this person was walking his dog in the area, he must have lived nearby. And here the detective noted one interesting fact. Behind the forested area where the witness saw the man, there was another residential complex. Given that the dog owner headed in that direction, he could well have lived there. The police went there and asked the staff if there was a man with a Labrador among the complex residents. They immediately gave them the name of 35-year-old Drew Planton, as well as added a few interesting details. All the complex employees considered him somewhat strange. He hardly talked to anyone, never looked people in the eye, and was generally very unsociable. The man was very thin with long hair and always wore baggy clothes. Many people thought he was trying to attract as little attention as possible. In his case, however, it worked just the opposite. The police decided to find out more about this person and talk to an elderly resident who, according to the staff, kept an eye on everything happening in the complex. And here, they were in for a very unexpected turn. When they told her they were investigating the murder of Stephanie Bennett, the woman replied, "Haven't you arrested anyone yet? Everyone knows it was that guy with the big dog." The detectives were, to say the least, shocked. It took them 2 years to get to this person, and the residents of his complex initially suspected this man, but none of them deemed it necessary to share their suspicions with the police. It turned out that Drew had moved out of that complex and settled on the other side of town. The investigators decided to talk to him and came to his apartment, but no one responded to their knock on the door. They came there several more times at different times of the day and never received an answer. Either the man was never home or he intentionally did not open the door for them. While they tried to locate Drew, the police questioned his former neighbors at his old place of residence. They managed to find several witnesses who shared troubling facts. A woman living on the floor above had seen Drew in the company of a young boy a few days after Stephanie's murder. They were walking down the street and talking about something. According to the witness, Drew asked the boy to stop contacting the police and not to tell them anything. The investigators immediately concluded that the young man in question was the same teenager who had stolen underwear from the victim's apartment. Several women had reported being genuinely afraid of Drew, having spotted him during their runs or walks in secluded areas. The man would either closely observe them or even follow them. Detectives who had been unable to speak with Drew found his place of work and headed there. He was a chemist at a fertilizer production laboratory, and the investigators managed to catch him at his workplace. He immediately stated that he had not heard of Stephanie Bennett's murder, which was strange considering that he lived just a kilometer away from her complex at the time. The man clearly had no desire to talk to the police and told them he was very busy at the moment. Drew told the investigators that they could come to his home at an appointed time, and he would answer all their questions. The detectives met him at his apartment, and the man finally opened the door to them. During the conversation, he stated that he had never walked his dog near Stephanie's complex. However, given that the police had many witnesses who had repeatedly seen him in that area, the investigators immediately understood that he was lying. The man also claimed that he did not wear glasses, even though his driver's license indicated that he was required to wear them while driving, and several witnesses had reported that the man who was peeping into the windows of other apartments wore glasses. As expected, Drew refused to voluntarily provide a DNA sample. The detectives then decided to conduct surveillance on him, hoping to obtain a sample in a different way. However, this proved to be a very difficult task since the man did not leave behind any items that could be sent to the laboratory. For example, during lunch breaks, he would leave work, sit in his car, and just stare at one point. The man did not eat anything, so the investigators could not obtain any objects with his DNA. Once they noticed Drew throwing an empty water bottle into a garbage bin. Detectives took it and sent it to the laboratory, but experts were unable to extract a DNA sample from it. According to one version, Drew took someone else's bottle and purposely threw it on the street, knowing that he was being watched. After that, the police decided to obtain his garbage, but here too they were unsuccessful. For several days they never saw Drew take it out. Interestingly, the man's neighbors also could not remember ever seeing him with the trash bag. Next, investigators asked Drew's boss for help. The woman agreed to help them obtain any item from his workplace that might contain Drew's DNA. She watched him for several days, but was unable to get a hold of any item. Drew rarely ate at work, never threw anything away, and she couldn't find a single hair on his desk, which seemed strange given that the man had fairly long hair. Investigators were already convinced that Drew was intentionally covering up all traces to prevent them from obtaining his DNA. One day, the boss saw him tying his hair back with a rubber band and then bending down to pick up all the hairs that fell in the process. After that, the woman decided to invite him for a lunch break at a cafe to supposedly discuss some work matters. But even there, the man was extremely cautious. He mostly ate with his hands, put all the used napkins in his pocket, and even took the straw and cup with his drink. For dessert, they ordered banana pudding, and Drew finally used a fork, but then wiped it with a damp napkin for 15 minutes, ruling out any possibility of obtaining a DNA sample from the utensil. Despite this, the investigators still took the fork and sent it to the laboratory. The experts were able to find tiny traces of DNA, which showed a partial match with the DNA of Stephanie's killer. However, the result was too imprecise, as more biological material was needed for a full comparison. In the end, the detectives obtained a warrant to search Drew's workplace. They hoped to find some item containing his DNA. The investigators were afraid that the man might escape if he found out about the search, so they decided to conduct it in the evening. Among the suspect's belongings, they found gloves that he had to wear when working with chemicals. The detectives understood that his DNA might be inside, so they took them and left another pair in their place. They still feared that Drew might try to run, so they kept him under surveillance for several days until the laboratory confirmed that the gloves did, in fact, contain his DNA. On October 18, 2005, police quietly surrounded the laboratory where a man worked and waited for him to come out. Investigators feared that if they tried to arrest him inside the building, he might take one of his colleagues hostage or attack them. Their concerns were not unfounded. When the man emerged from the building, he was immediately apprehended. He was found to have a loaded pistol on him and apparently knew that the police were just steps away from catching him and had no plans to surrender easily. During a 6-hour interrogation, the man, Drew, remained silent and refused food, water, and hardly moved. Eventually, detectives had to put him in a wheelchair to move him around the area. After obtaining a search warrant for his apartment, investigators found a laundry basket stolen from Stephanie's home. In addition, there were 9 pistols, 2 rifles, 40 knives, a sword, and a machete. Among his belongings, detectives also found a set of lockpicks and handcuffs. They found a notebook with dozens of women's names and immediately located them to ensure they were safe. One of the women was the same resident of his complex who had complained about Drew during the investigation. She said that he had been watching her on the street and she felt uncomfortable with his gaze. Her concerns were confirmed when police found her underwear and tampons in Drew's home, as well as a copy of her high school graduation tape. It turned out that Drew had broken into her apartment, taken the tape, made a copy, and returned the original. All this time, he kept these items even after moving. In his apartment, they also found a check in the name of a woman who was killed in 1999. Investigators learned that at the time, Drew lived in her city and, moreover, the woman was shot with a fairly rare caliber gun, but exactly such a weapon was found in the man's collection during the search. Thus, Drew became a suspect in this case. But first, he had to stand trial for the murder of Stephanie. A month after his arrest, the prosecution officially announced that they would seek the death penalty. The trial was supposed to begin the following year, and Drew spent that time in solitary confinement. But the trial never happened. On January 1st, 2006, a man was found dead in the same cell. Despite all precautions taken, he managed to end his life. Investigators had no doubt that Drew had killed Stephanie Bennett. But after a search of his house, the inevitable question arose: how many other victims could this person have had? At the very least, he was highly likely to have been responsible for the woman's murder in 1999. But detectives were practically certain that Drew could have been involved in other crimes. After carefully studying his biography, the police discovered several interesting facts. Drew grew up in a complete family with 3 brothers. Their father constantly humiliated and beat the children until the mother fled with them to another state. As a result, Drew became a very withdrawn teenager, and this only intensified in the future. Despite this, he received a good education and got a decent job as a chemist. His colleagues said he was very smart, but his social skills were practically non-existent. He had no friends, he didn't talk to anyone at work, and always tried to keep as far away from the team as possible. Interestingly, Drew's own brother also had a criminal record. He peeped at women with a hidden camera and received a suspended sentence. In 2008, Drew's mother sued the state government, accusing the authorities of causing her son's death. However, the judge concluded that the prison staff had taken all prescribed precautions and could not stop the man. Stephanie Bennett's father tried to sue the management of the residential complex for ignoring residents' reports of a peeping Tom and not paying enough attention to the safety of residents on the premises. In his opinion, there was not enough lighting around the building at night, and anyone could walk there unnoticed. He also learned that the window in his daughter's apartment had been broken, but the complex management did not rush to fix this problem, even though it was their direct responsibility. But in the end, the man himself refused these accusations, not commenting on his decision. Thus, this complex and confusing case was ultimately solved. Police to this day wonder how many other victims could Drew have had. The available information indicates that the man was prone to serial crimes, but after his death, it became practically impossible to find out the truth. Nicole Cable was born on August 12, 1997, in the small American town of Glenburn, Maine. Her parents divorced when she was young, and the young woman was left to live with her mother, stepfather, and 3 younger sisters. During her high school years, Nicole had a passion for music, was on the cheerleading team, and even modeled for a local company. She also had many friends who described the young woman as cheerful, helpful, and kind. She always tried to keep a positive outlook on life, even though she, like many teenagers, had her own difficulties. In the spring of 2013, when the young woman was 15 years old, she was looking forward to the approaching school vacations and her birthday. Only a few months separated her from getting the driver's license she had dreamed of for so long. Nicole lived in a tiny town where there was practically nothing but a few apartment buildings. However, about 20 kilometers away were larger communities where almost all of her friends lived, and there were many more distractions. Even her school was a 20-minute drive from home, and she had to wait for the bus every morning. On Sunday evening, May 12th, Nicole told her parents that she was going to meet a friend and would be back soon. She left the house at about 9 p.m. and headed along the main road, but she never returned home. Concerned parents tried to call her, but her phone was turned off and she hadn't logged on to social media. When they contacted her friends, they learned that none of them had seen Nicole that night. After waiting until morning, her mother decided to go to the police. She had hoped to the last that Nicole had simply stayed the night at her friend's house, even though that raised serious questions. First of all, the young woman had never left home all night without her parents' permission. Secondly, she would certainly have contacted her mother and told her where she was. The police immediately began a search. At first stages, they refused to stick to any one version. Investigators admitted that the young woman could have left home of her own free will, but they also did not rule out a criminal element. The first day of searching brought no results. Police interviewed friends and relatives of the young woman and began searching for her in the Glenburn area. Nicole's parents created a Facebook group to report their daughter missing and urged the public to help find her. That same day, her friends printed and posted hundreds of flyers, both inside and outside Glenburn. Police asked for volunteers to stay away from the area to avoid having service dogs pick up her trail. On the second day, the police held a press conference where Nicole's mother made an appeal. With tears in her eyes, she asked her daughter to return home if she ran away of her own free will. The mother also spoke out about a possible kidnapping and urged those responsible to let Nicole go if someone was holding her. The head of the local police added that the search operation would be expanded. The FBI and state police became involved, bringing the total number of officers involved to 45. The public soon learned one disturbing fact. Nicole's mother revealed that her daughter had been texting with a certain guy on Facebook for weeks. Police accessed Nicole's account and discovered that this young man was Brian Butterfield. Moreover, based on the correspondence on the day of her disappearance, the young woman had arranged to meet him at the edge of the street where her house was located. At first, the police declined to comment on the situation, but new details soon emerged. It turned out that Brian had gone to the same school as Nicole and knew her personally. But during the questioning, the guy claimed he had only spoken to the young woman a few times in his life and had never corresponded with her on Facebook. Against this backdrop, another oddity was noticed. There were two Brian Butterfield Facebook accounts. Only one of them was deleted the night Nicole disappeared. Brian himself stated that he only had one account and had nothing to do with his second account. Furthermore, he was aware of the existence of this fake page and had even complained to the police a few weeks before Nicole disappeared. It all looked really strange, and the police were in no hurry to accuse the young man of any crime. Instead, they continued to search the area around Glenburn, hoping to find some evidence. At the same time, the computer department was taking a detailed look at this suspicious Facebook account. On Friday, May 17th, the sheriff turned to the public for information. Police were looking for a black Ford Ranger pickup truck and asked for any information about the vehicle. They clarified that the driver's involvement in the young woman's disappearance has not been determined, and it is too early to draw any conclusions. The sheriff also announced a 24-hour hotline for any tips on the case. They had to allocate a separate number as the number of calls had crossed several hundred. On the sixth day, police announced they were enlisting volunteers to search the area. They set up assembly points and put people into groups. The volunteers were to look for anything that might be relevant, and this time, the search area was greatly expanded. They extended to the two nearest towns, Bangor and Old Town. More than 500 people responded to the police call. The crowd included about 400 local residents and about 100 professional volunteers from the various counties. In addition, there were off-road vehicle and horse-drawn search parties. Given the sheer scale of the operation and the rough terrain, the authorities tried to use every resource possible. They even used aerial photography in the hope that the footage might reveal something of value to the investigation. The day after the search, exactly 1 week after Nicole's disappearance, the police issued a disappointing statement. The young woman's body was found near Old Town in a wooded area not far from Road 43. They were in no hurry to release any details, specifying only that the body was covered with branches and was discovered by a service dog. Soon it was announced that the police had a homicide case, and the next day, May 20th, they reported the arrest of a suspect. It turned out to be a 20-year-old local man named Kyle Doobie. No details were known at the time, and the public was kept in the dark for some time. The next day, he was formally charged with premeditated murder. At the same time, it turned out that at the time of his arrest, he was already in prison. The guy had been sentenced to 90 days in jail for eluding police and a motorcycle accident last year. Kyle began serving his sentence 3 days before Nicole's body was discovered, but had been on the outside until then. According to the young woman's friends, she had known Kyle for several months. The day before she disappeared, she complained to several friends that Kyle had tried to kiss her, and Nicole had to give him a serious fight to get him to stop. Nevertheless, the police so far had kept the evidence against the man a secret. It was known that he lived with his parents and a 4-year-old daughter over whom he had custody. Kyle was also dating an 18-year-old young woman named Sarah and worked for a local disability care company. His attorney asked for a closed-door preliminary hearing, and the judge granted the request. Consequently, the public and the media had no access to information about the case, and the judge's decision was criticized. Nicole's funeral was held on May 26th. Beforehand, several hundred local residents gathered and honored her memory by launching balloons into the sky. A few days after the funeral, a judge, under public pressure, lifted a public disclosure ban on the case, and some disturbing facts finally came to light. First, police were able to determine that the fake Facebook account was registered from Kyle's computer, and all subsequent sessions were conducted from his IP address. This meant that it was Kyle who had tricked her out of the house shortly before the murder, and it was clear from the medical examiner's report that the young woman had died on the very day of her disappearance. Second, the police had several important witnesses at once: Kyle's own brother and his girlfriend. According to Sarah, whom the suspect was dating, Kyle confessed to her about the murder a few days after it happened. This happened immediately after Sarah was called in for questioning. There it became clear to her that the police had suspicions about Kyle, but there was no evidence. He was also questioned but stated that he was at work the day the young woman disappeared. Kyle told his brother that he lured Nicole to the outskirts of town using a fake Facebook account. The guy planned to make it look like Brian Butterfield had kidnapped her and was holding her in a remote location. Next, Kyle planned to find her and set her free, which he thought would make the young woman fall in love with her savior. It all sounds strange to say the least, but there is more to come. Remember only that this is the perpetrator's own version, told to his brother. Further events unfolded as follows. From a fake account, Kyle lured Nicole to a remote location along Hudson Road. There he was already waiting for her, lurking in the bushes. He was wearing a ski hat covering his face. When Nicole arrived at the appointed spot, he pounced on her, wrapped tape around her head, and loaded her into his father's pickup truck, a black Ford Ranger. The car was parked nearby. Next, in his own words, Kyle drove her away from the abduction site. As he began to pull her out of the car, he noticed that the young woman showed no signs of life. The guy realized that the duct tape made it impossible for her to breathe, and she passed away. Then he panicked and decided to hide the body. To his girlfriend, Kyle told the same story, adding some details. He said that before he hid the body, he took off almost all of Nicole's clothes and threw her out the car window on the way back home. This was done so that the police would not find traces of his DNA. The police did find several items of clothing that belonged to the young woman. They were in virtually the same place where Kyle had attacked Nicole. The key point here was that Kyle told his girlfriend almost exactly where he had hidden the body. It was because Sarah went to the police telling the whole story that they were able to locate Nicole's body. Kyle himself refused to admit guilt, but the situation was far from in his favor. When the police uncovered all the details of the medical examination, more serious evidence emerged against the suspect. Under Nicole's fingernails, blood was found that matched Kyle's DNA sample exactly. When the boy was questioned a few days after the murder, there were deep scratches on his face. He himself attributed it to an injury he sustained at work. Also, the cause of the young woman's death was strangulation, as evidenced by the injuries to the neck. This went against Kyle's versions of what he told his brother and the young woman. If he had taped the victim's mouth and nose, there would have been no such injuries. His lawyer requested a psychological evaluation, which caused the trial to slow down. But a few months after his arrest, something interesting happened. Kyle was charged with theft after a stolen gun was found in his home. The guy had been arrested multiple times before for robbery, but each time he got away with a fine. An examination showed Kyle to be completely sane, and a trial was set for February 2015. While awaiting trial, the defendant was in jail. Before the trial began, Kyle's attorney filed a motion to exclude certain witness statements from the case file. One of them was the correctional officer where Kyle arrived to serve a sentence for eluding police and a motorcycle accident. According to the officer, the guy was acting very nervous and even crying. When asked why he was so nervous, Kyle said something like, "It's not about the time limit, it's about what else I've done." The trial began on February 22, 2015. Kyle's lawyer stated that his client was innocent in murder and that the investigation was completely biased. According to the defense, he was at home at the time of the murder and Nicole was attacked by someone else. Kyle's girlfriend, Sarah, was named as a possible suspect. She allegedly hated Nicole because of her association with her boyfriend. The lawyer claimed that she had access to Kyle's computer, from which she could create a fake account to frame her boyfriend after the murder. This theory had no corroboration and went against the actual evidence. Kyle logged into the fake account not only from his computer, but also from his phone. What's more, he logged in through one app, changing his personal account to a fake one. Because of this, it was clearly visible when he logged out to one account and immediately logged into another. Also, there was no physical evidence against Sarah, unlike Kyle. His DNA was found not only under the victim's fingernails, but also on her clothes, which the killer threw away on his way home. The next witness was the real Brian Butterfield. He stated that Kyle had long had a grudge against him because Brian had previously dated his girlfriend. In his opinion, this is what led Kyle to create a fake account with his name so that he could frame the young man if anything happened. The prosecution also provided screenshots of correspondence showing that Kyle was not only communicating with Nicole, but also with other underage young women. The next witness was a colleague of Kyle's who worked with him at a disability care company. The defendant's lawyer insisted that the scratches on Kyle's face appeared while he was working, but the witness denied this. According to his story, on May 11 and 12, he and Kyle were at the home of a woman suffering from mental illness. At one time, she became aggressive and attacked Kyle, leaving several scratches on his face near his eye. Kyle went to the hospital for help, only to notice the next day, May 13, a coworker noticed new scars on his face. This happened right after Nicole disappeared. Another coworker said that the day Nicole disappeared, Kyle left work at about 9 p.m. and did not return until 6 a.m., even though he was supposed to be on duty all night. At the same time, he asked that he not tell anyone about his absence. The court also summoned 4 inmates with whom Kyle had interacted while in jail, awaiting trial. They all said that Kyle had confessed to them about killing the young woman. To one of them, he told them he had strangled his girlfriend and made it look like an accident. To the other, he openly stated that he'd originally planned to commit the crime. Even more interesting was the testimony of an inmate named Scott Ford. He had spent most of his life behind bars and had a reputation for being well-versed in the legal system. Kyle had been in contact with him for a long time, after which he decided to inquire about the best way for him to get away with his crime. Next, Kyle wrote several versions on paper of what had happened to Nicole and handed the pieces of paper with this information to Ford. All of these versions had one thing in common. Kyle admitted that he had created a fake account and lured Nicole to a deserted area, but he went on to describe different versions of events. First, he wrote that he had just wanted to kidnap her and then rescue her, but he didn't settle for duct tape and the young woman suffocated. On another sheet, he said that he had jumped Nicole out of the bushes and she fainted from fright. Panicked, Kyle duct taped her mouth shut and drove her away from town, after which he noticed she had no pulse. Another version was that he didn't use the duct tape and the young woman died for nothing. Another version said that Kyle jumped out of the bushes and grabbed her torso, but then realized that he had actually squeezed her throat, after which she lost consciousness. As we can see, all of these stories seem downright delusional, but there was something really useful in them for the investigation. Kyle described in detail the place where he attacked her and where and how he hid the body. Moreover, he specified the exact location where he had hidden the ski mask in which he had attacked the young woman. All this information was kept secret until the beginning of the trial, so only the killer could know such details. Experts examined the sheets and found fingerprints and Kyle's DNA on them. The trial was not without its difficulties. Kyle's younger brother, who had testified against him 2 years earlier, began to deny the fact that Kyle had confessed to the murder. The problem was that the brother had written down all the details of what had happened in great detail, which he could only have learned from Kyle. The only one who didn't utter a word during the entire trial was Kyle himself. He refused to testify even in his own defense. The investigation offered him a deal in which he could expect a reduced sentence in exchange for a confession, but he refused. On March 6, 2016, the final court hearing was held, at which the verdict was handed down. Kyle was found guilty of the premeditated murder of Nicole. His relatives and attorney tried to get a lenient sentence, citing his age and having a young daughter, but the court refused to make concessions. Kyle received 60 years for murder and another 30 for kidnapping. In closing arguments, the judge noted that the evidence against Kyle was overwhelming and his guilt in the case was clear. Instead of showing remorse and confessing, he made up various versions of what happened and tried his best to avoid prison. For this reason, the court refused to commute his sentence. Moreover, the judge was inclined to believe that Kyle had originally planned to kill Nicole, a plan he had been working on for weeks. Nicole's parents called the sentence fair and expressed a hope that he would never get out of prison again. They also gave numerous interviews and appeared on various television shows talking about the dangers of social media, using their daughter's murder as an example. In their opinion, the tragedy could have been avoided if the perpetrator had not had the opportunity to impersonate another person online. However, people like Kyle, sooner or later, can get to the point of murder even without fake accounts. Amanda Lenke was born on June 7, 1991 in Tennessee. She grew up in a large and friendly family with several brothers and sisters. Later, they moved with their parents to Spring Hill, Florida, where Amanda attended the local middle school. She was passionate about dancing, writing poetry, playing multiple musical instruments, and was a very positive child. During school vacations, Amanda always went to her grandparents' house in a small town called White Cloud. She loved spending time there as she had many friends in the town. White Cloud was a quiet and peaceful place with a population of only 1,400 people. Most of its residents knew each other, children played without supervision, and no one worried about their safety. In 2004, when she was only 13 years old, Amanda finished the 7th grade of middle school and went to White Cloud for the whole summer. She spent a lot of time with her friends, went for walks, and enjoyed her vacation. On June 20th, Amanda stayed overnight at her best friend's house. They talked, had fun, and went to bed late at night. In the morning, her friend woke up and found that Amanda was not in the room. The bedroom windows were wide open. She went to the kitchen, walked around the house, but Amanda was nowhere to be found. It was strange because all her belongings, including clothes and a backpack, were left in the bedroom. The friend told her parents that Amanda was missing, and they called her grandparents. They walked several streets and called the parents of Amanda's other friends, but no one had seen her. Then the relatives decided to go to the police. They understood that Amanda could not have gone anywhere without warning, especially in just her pajamas. First, investigators talked to Amanda's friend. According to her, she didn't hear anything that night, and Amanda never told her that she was planning to leave. At the time of the disappearance, the friend's parents, as well as her brother and sister, were in the house. None of them heard or saw anything. Police tried to find witnesses who lived near the house, but they also hit a dead end. On that night, no residents noticed anything strange. On the first day of the investigation, the investigators concluded that the girl, with a high probability, had left home on her own initiative and run away. They argued that they found no signs of struggle in the house and that 5 people did not hear anything. It was difficult to imagine a scenario in which Amanda could have been abducted without waking up her friend who was sleeping just a meter away. This version caused outrage among Amanda's relatives. They insisted that the girl had no problems at home and was happy to spend the entire summer in White Cloud. In addition, they pointed out that the girl left all her things, including clothes, in her friend's room. According to the police's version, she decided to run away in just her pajamas. When the news of Amanda's disappearance spread throughout the district, the police received several calls from people saying they had seen a similar girl in different places. This only reinforced the detectives' confidence that Amanda had run away from home, but they could not confirm any of these leads. The investigators decided to check the girl's computer, hoping to find some information that could help in the search. They found correspondence with a certain young man, and based on this, the police assumed that Amanda ran away to meet him. However, there were discrepancies. There was no mention of a possible meeting in these correspondence, and it was about ordinary and everyday topics. Nevertheless, the investigators considered this enough to once again convince themselves of their correctness. At that time, they did not disclose all the details of the investigation, but information about correspondence with a certain guy spread throughout the city, so many local residents also began to think that the girl simply ran away from home. Meanwhile, her relatives were posting flyers and giving interviews to various media outlets. They insisted that Amanda could not have run away on her own initiative, and the police were not putting in all the effort to find her because of this misconception. The investigators did not really use the full range of their capabilities. If they officially considered this case as a kidnapping, they could have involved the FBI and other agencies in the investigation. Instead, they were convinced that the girl simply left home and, for this reason, searched for her half-heartedly. They never found any serious leads on Amanda's possible location, and the investigation stretched on for several weeks. On the morning of July 5th, mushroom pickers went to a forest located approximately 10 kilometers from White Cloud, where they found a human body and reported it to the police. Investigators arrived at the scene and immediately recognized the body as Amanda Lanke. She was wearing the same pajamas she had disappeared in from her friend's house. Later, medical experts officially confirmed her identity and determined that Amanda had received multiple blows from a heavy object and died on the night of her disappearance. Detectives concluded that the victim had been killed elsewhere and then brought to the forest. They could not find any significant leads, so they decided to interview everyone who knew the girl. Over the next few days, police questioned approximately 400 people, which constituted almost 1/3 of the entire population of White Cloud. Investigators even used a polygraph, but it did not yield any results. They also decided to take another look at the young man with whom Amanda had corresponded online. The problem was that the word killer was used in his nickname. Police considered the possibility that the victim actually went to meet him and he killed her. However, this version still had many inconsistencies. There was nothing to suggest that the girl would have gone to meet someone in her pajamas in the middle of the night. Furthermore, there was no hint of a personal meeting in their correspondence. The investigator could not identify this person, and soon the version of his involvement was no longer considered. In an attempt to get some new leads, detectives decided to study all of Amanda's belongings, which led to a breakthrough. They found her personal diary, which contained very disturbing information. Shortly before her death, Amanda wrote that a certain man had been harassing her, and the next several pages were torn out. Investigators suspected that his name was written on them. This diary immediately became the main lead in the case. Police tried to identify the man's identity. They talked to all of Amanda's friends and asked if the girl had mentioned anything about this. Several of her friends admitted that she had indeed told them about it and even named the man, Cecil Wallace. He was the stepfather of Amanda's friend with whom she had stayed the night. For detectives, this information was a real surprise. They had been looking for the killer all over the town and beyond, and in the end, the possible culprit was in the same house as the victim. But the testimony of the friends was not enough to arrest him. Investigators had no substantial evidence against the man. No DNA samples were found on the victim's body, and the court documents did not indicate whether she had been subjected to violence. Detectives questioned Wallace, but he denied any involvement in the crimes. The police themselves wondered how the man could have done all this unnoticed in a small house where his wife and 3 children slept. Without serious evidence or confession, they could not detain Wallace. Therefore, the detectives continued to work on all possible leads. Soon after, an interesting fact emerged. It turned out that Wallace's sister, Candace, worked in the police department that was handling Amanda's case. Moreover, the woman actively helped her brother and his family during the interrogations. She literally told him what to say and how to behave. But that was not all. 5 years ago, she was fired from another police department for falsifying a report on her brother's accident. She wrote that he was driving on a road when a deer ran out in front of him. However, in reality, the man was drunk and had an accident. By that time, other detectives were already handling Amanda's case, and they questioned the objectivity of the investigation by the local police. However, they could not confirm that anyone other than Candace could be helping Wallace. The investigators questioned the man and his family several more times, but all of this did not yield any results. They continued to look for any leads, but in the end, this case stretched on for several years. During this time, the Wallace family complained several times to the police that their home had been vandalized. The fact that the townspeople unanimously believed that the man was a murderer and that he was being covered up by his sister only increased the negative sentiments. The fact that Wallace continued to live among them freely only intensified these feelings. 4 years after the murder, in 2008, detectives turned to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children for help. They sent their investigators to White Cloud, where they reviewed all the case materials, conducted new interrogations, and tried to find new leads. Ultimately, they came to the same conclusion as the local detectives. There was not enough evidence to make an arrest. 3 more years passed, and in 2011, the police finally got a new lead that changed everything. A 27-year-old girl from Texas who grew up in White Cloud went to a news website from her old town. There, she came across information about Amanda's murder and started looking into it. After reading that the victim had spent the night at the Wallace house, the woman decided to go to the police and tell them something disturbing. In 1998, when she still lived in that city and was 13 years old, she stayed overnight at the Wallace house because she was friends with his second foster daughter. In the middle of the night, a man entered their room and assaulted both of them. He then threatened them to keep quiet. The victims were too scared to go to the police, so they never told anyone about what had happened. But after the adult victim learned about Amanda's case, she decided to contact the police. Furthermore, she wrote a statement to the police, which helped investigators to get closer to the arrest of the suspect. They interviewed a large number of White Cloud residents who could potentially have been affected by Wallace's actions, and this tactic worked. They were able to find several women who admitted that the man had touched them inappropriately. All of this happened between 1998 and 2002. The victims were then between 13 and 16 years old. Gathering all this information together, in October 2011, police arrested 43-year-old Wallace. He was charged with molesting these victims, as well as the man who was officially named as a suspect in Amanda's case for the first time. Knowing all that other women had told them, detectives had no doubt about his involvement in the murder. At the preliminary hearing, he was granted bail of $150,000, and somehow he was able to pay this amount. Apparently, his sister and other relatives helped him gather the money. The trial was supposed to begin in a month. While waiting for this, Wallace returned to work, but local residents were unhappy that he had been released on bail. They repeatedly protested outside the company's office, demanding that this man be fired. On November 10th, on the day of the first court hearing, an unexpected turn occurred. Wallace did not show up at the appointed time, and the police immediately declared him wanted. A few hours later, they managed to find his car in the woods near the city. The man was there too. The only thing was that he had taken his own life. Detectives, who did not expect such a turn of events, were forced to continue the investigation. After the suspect's death, they could only rely on significant evidence that could link him to Amanda's death. They obtained a search warrant for his home, trying to find anything related to her murder. The police examined every corner, tore down some walls, and removed floorboards, but they could not find any serious evidence. Afterwards, they shifted their focus to the suspect's sister, Candace. Detectives were certain that she was covering up for her brother and wanted to find out if she knew that he had killed Amanda. After gathering the necessary evidence, Candace was arrested in August 2012. She was charged with intentionally misleading the investigation, but that was only the beginning. During the investigation, detectives found out that Candace had been covering up for her brother during the times when he was dealing in illegal substances. Furthermore, she taught him how to not leave any evidence at the crime scenes. She showed him how to properly wipe his fingerprints off surfaces so that experts couldn't lift them. Candace also advised him to always carry a cigarette with someone else's DNA on it, so that if necessary, he could plant it at the crime scene. Detectives also concluded that at least 9 people knew about Wallace's crimes, but remained silent. All of them were members of his family. The police were unable to prove their guilt. The investigation into Candace's involvement continued for 2 years until 2014, when she made a deal with the police. She admitted to lying to the investigators, and in exchange, 2 other charges were dropped. The issue was that Wallace's sister could not provide consulting services on a case that she was working on as a police officer. Given that she had been helping her brother through interrogations, she broke this rule and was ultimately punished for it. However, Candace continued to insist that her brother was innocent. The court sentenced her to 30 weekends in jail. This is a dubious practice where the convict is only required to be in the jail building for 2 days a week and can freely roam during the rest of the time. Such sentences serve as a kind of half measure, and if a person has committed a minor offense, they can be given several weekends in jail. This way, they receive a punishment, but it does not strongly affect their life. The convicted person can continue to go to work and spend time with their family. Of course, Amanda's relatives were extremely dissatisfied with this decision. They, like the detectives, were sure that Candace had helped her brother avoid punishment. Proving it 100% was not possible. Therefore, she got off with such a minor punishment. The Amanda's family was forced to go through yet another trial. In 2004, medical experts only handed over part of her remains to them so they could hold a funeral. The rest was to be kept by detectives during the investigation, but after Wallace's death, a decision was made to hand over these remains to the relatives. In 2013, the girl's family had to exhume her remains to bury Amanda again. Her mother still hopes that investigators will find any evidence that will prove Wallace's guilt. She also tries to achieve changes in the legislation to change the police approach to searching for missing children. The woman insists that investigators should not conduct an investigation based on their subjective assessments and consider the disappearance as a voluntary escape from home. Thus, there is almost no doubt that Wallace killed Amanda. But what was his motive? Considering that there is no information in the court documents about whether the victim was subjected to violence, two assumptions can be made. He probably did assault her but did not leave his biological material, so the investigation decided not to reveal this fact since it was unnecessary. Detectives could also keep this information secret for the sake of the investigation, hoping that the criminal would reveal facts that had never been told. His past crimes also speak in favor of Wallace being the killer. He assaulted at least 3 victims using the same scheme. All of them stayed at his house overnight. The question remains, why did he kill Amanda? Perhaps he planned to intimidate her like the others, but the girl threatened to tell the truth to everyone. Or she tried to run away from him and then he panicked. Something else in this case is very alarming. Detectives suggested that all of Wallace's relatives who were in the house on the night of the murder knew about this crime and even helped the man hide it. In addition to Amanda, his wife, son, and daughter were there. This could explain how he managed to attack the victim without waking any of his relatives. In any case, even without a final verdict from the court, Wallace will no longer be able to harm anyone. The fact that he settled the score with his life before the trial once again speaks in favor of his guilt, even though he took the details of this crime to the grave. Lindy Sue Beekler was born on January 31, 1956, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. When she was young, her parents divorced and she stayed with her mother. Her father started a new family but continued to see his daughter regularly. Soon, he had a son with whom Lindy was in constant communication. After school, she enrolled at Millersville University, a state college located just 10 minutes from home. At the age of 19, Lindy met a man named Philip Beekler, and the couple soon married. He also attended courses at the college while working for a car rental company. Lindy herself worked part-time at a local flower shop. After the wedding, they rented an apartment in the Manor Township residential complex just a few minutes from the college. The newlyweds began their life together and were happy with each other. However, almost immediately after moving in, Lindy's happiness was overshadowed by a series of unpleasant events. She began to notice that someone was constantly watching her in this residential complex, but she never managed to see who it could be. The young woman often complained to friends and relatives, but they attributed what was happening to stress after the move. One evening, when Lindy was home alone, she noticed the man looking at her through the glass door inserts. The apartment was on the first floor and her husband was at work at the time. The man immediately disappeared, leaving Lindy terrified. Since then, the young woman was afraid to be alone at home, but due to Philip's evening schedule, she often had to be alone until it was dark. Lindy was constantly stressed and any incident could bring her to panic. Soon after this event, she spent time with her brother and his family at their home when they heard the sound of breaking glass from the second floor. It turned out that a wall mirror had fallen to the floor and shattered. The young woman was so scared that she started shaking. She asked her relatives to go around the whole house and make sure that no one else had broken in. All this stress was the result of the fact that some unknown man had been watching her for several months. But all of her acquaintances still believed that the young woman was overreacting and that nothing serious was happening to her. On December 5, 1975, Lindy finished her shift at a flower shop and stopped by her husband's workplace before heading to a local store to do some shopping. Around the same time, her aunt and uncle went to their son's basketball game and decided to invite Lindy along as they knew she was afraid to be alone at home and wanted to distract her for a few hours. They arrived at her apartment at around 8:45 p.m. Lindy's aunt approached the door and found it open, which immediately alarmed her. She went inside and saw a knocked-over lamp in the living room, but the worst was waiting for her in the kitchen. Lindy's body lay there. She was laying face down with no signs of life, and a meat cleaver with a towel wrapped around its handle was found in her neck. Lindy's aunt immediately called the police, and detectives began investigating the crime scene. The first thing they noticed was that Lindy was fully dressed, which cast doubt on the motive being related to rape. Additionally, no valuables were missing from the apartment, ruling out robbery as a possibility. There were no signs of forced entry on the front door or windows, suggesting that Lindy either knew her attacker and let them in voluntarily, or the attacker entered the apartment when the door was left unlocked. The fact that Lindy had purchased a lot of groceries and physically couldn't have carried all the bags from the parking lot to her apartment in one go suggests that her killer may have entered the apartment just after she had taken the first load inside and gone back to her car for the second. While the police were investigating the crime scene, Lindy's husband and parents were informed of what had happened. The grieving family members were desperate to see Lindy and had to be restrained by detectives. Forensic investigators found bloodstains on the floor and walls, but DNA testing was not available at the time, so they could not compare these samples to Lindy's DNA. They did conclude that Lindy had put up a fight with her attacker. A male shoe print was found in one of the rooms, and medical experts determined that Lindy had received 19 blows from a sharp object. The perpetrator had used two weapons, the meat cleaver from Lindy's kitchen and a second weapon, presumably a knife, that was never found. Later, it was confirmed that Lindy had indeed been sexually assaulted, but DNA evidence could not be extracted from the crime scene. At the time, DNA testing was not advanced enough to be of much help in solving the case. The police had hoped to find witnesses, but none of their neighbors were home at the time of the murder. Other residents did not notice anything suspicious. However, several people reported seeing a car parked in the residential complex parking lot from around 7 p.m. to 8:40 p.m., which coincided with the time of Lindy's murder. Additionally, none of the residents knew the owner of the car. Unfortunately, detectives were unable to locate it and switched to another line of investigation. As is often the case in such situations, the victim's husband became a suspect. Despite Philip being at work and having a solid alibi, investigators did not rule out his possible involvement. Over the next few months, detectives interviewed about 300 people who could have been involved in the murder, but all that yielded no results. At some point, they began to suspect a local serial rapist who had committed several attacks on women around the same time Lindy was killed. However, they were unable to find any evidence linking him to the case, and the culprit himself died during an attempt to escape from prison. Moreover, investigators found out that at the time of the murder, he was at work, and eventually, they stopped considering him as a suspect. 4 months after the murder, there was a new twist in the case. A 43-year-old woman named Mary was killed 25 kilometers away from Lindy's apartment. She received multiple stab wounds, and the detectives immediately noted that these murders were almost 100% similar. But soon the culprit was caught, and investigators could not find any connection between him and Lindy. The man admitted to killing Mary but denied involvement in the other crimes. After that, the police had no leads, and the case went cold for a year. On December 26, 1976, Lindy's relatives went to visit her grave at the local cemetery. Upon arriving, they saw that the gravestone was covered in red paint and heavily scratched. They immediately reported it to the police, but they were unable to find the vandals. Investigators concluded that the perpetrator of the desecration may have been Lindy's killer, as no other graves were damaged. The nature of the damage also supported this theory, as the criminal clearly harbored animosity towards the deceased, in addition to the obvious association with the red paint. By using a knife or sharp object, the perpetrator had to have spent a considerable amount of time damaging the stone in order to completely cover it with deep scratches. Just a few weeks later, something even stranger happened. Chief Donald W. Scheller, whose department was investigating Lindy's murder, received an anonymous 2-page letter. The first part was written from the perspective of the killer, who taunted the police for not being able to catch him yet. The author took responsibility for the vandalism of Lindy's grave and demanded that the letter be published in the next day's local newspapers. In exchange, the anonymous writer promised to consider surrendering to the police. He then went on to provide several characteristics to help investigators identify him, claiming to be 178 centimeters tall, weighing 93 kilograms, living in the western suburbs of Lancaster, having a good job, being single, and having been caught a few years earlier for possession of illegal substances. On the day of the murder, he was also under the influence of drugs. The last part of the letter was a plea for help, with the unknown author asking to be caught before he killed anyone else. The second page was a separate letter allegedly written by the killer's friend, named Jenny Scrum. She wrote that her acquaintance truly intended to surrender once his letter was published in the newspapers, and added that the man was mentally ill. She purportedly added this message while he was sleeping, before placing both sheets in an envelope. Police believed that the author could indeed be Lindy's killer, but they did not believe the second part about his friend Jenny. Despite being written in a different handwriting, investigators believe that the perpetrator may have asked someone he knew to write it or use some other method to forge the handwriting. They also failed to notice the similarity of this message to the letter sent by a serial killer nicknamed the Zodiac Killer, who operated in California in the 60s and 70s, regularly communicating with the police and newspapers through anonymous text messages. Investigators even considered that he might have been responsible for Lindy's murder. However, this theory was highly stretched. Firstly, the killer was operating on the opposite side of the country. Secondly, by the time Lindy was killed, according to the police, the Zodiac Killer had already stopped his killings. Chief Donald W. Scheller decided not to publish the letter in the newspaper, as the author requested. At that time, the police had 2 suspects, and they did not want to compromise the investigation. Detectives did not believe that the culprit would surrender and saw no point in scarring residents with a letter from a madman. Eventually, they began to doubt that the author was actually Lindy's killer. The letter did not contain any details that had not already appeared in the newspapers. The police profiler even suggested that the author of both sheets could be a mentally ill woman who had no connection to the case. He made this conclusion after analyzing the writing style. Despite this, investigators located a woman named Jenny Scrum and, after talking to her, concluded that she had nothing to do with these letters. From that moment on, the police had no serious leads, but they continued to investigate the case. At various stages, they had new suspects. Lindy's mother's partner, a regular visitor to the flower shop where she worked, and even one of the investigators on the case. After brief checks, detectives came to the conclusion that none of them were involved in the murder. In 1980, the police had another chance to solve the case. In Florida, they arrested serial killer Gerald Stano, who admitted to killing 41 people. At the time of Lindy's death, his father lived just 10 minutes away from her complex, so detectives considered the possibility that Stano might have been the killer. But they could not find any evidence that the man visited his father and soon stopped considering him as a suspect. In 1997, experts were able to extract a male DNA profile, discovering traces of semen on the victim's underwear. This sample did not match any of the suspects that investigators had for 23 years. Since then, the police have not had any significant leads, and the case went cold. It was reviewed in 2000, but with no results in the same year, detectives decided to publish a letter in newspapers, supposedly written by the killer, hoping it would help them get new leads, but it didn't. Lindy's parents never found out the truth about her murder. Lindy's father passed away in 2000, and her mother in 2007. The next major breakthrough only occurred in 2019, after the case was reopened again. Investigators decided to turn to a private laboratory called Paramedics Nanolabs, which specializes in genetic research and has helped solve similar cases in the past. Using an innovative method called DNA phenotyping, experts were able to create an approximate portrait of Lindy's killer at the ages of 25 and 60. This method works by studying the criminal's DNA sample and finding information about possible physical traits, such as skin color, eye color, hair color, and so on. Such portraits often turn out to be very similar to real DNA holders, although there are exceptions. The killer's portraits were widely distributed through the media. Investigators hoped someone would recognize this man, but in the end, they didn't get any serious leads. A year later, they turned to Paramedics Nanolabs again, this time to use the method of genetic genealogy. This is also a relatively new method that allows experts to find possible relatives of any person based on their DNA. Investigators provided them with a genetic sample from Lindy's killer and waited. The main drawback of this method is the incredible complexity of the research. Experts have to study thousands of people, eliminating unsuitable candidates until they finally find a relative of the DNA holder. After many months of hard work, they were able to find a person who was distantly related to the killer. He turned out to be a resident of Italy, and now investigators could begin to examine his family tree. They were looking for a man who was in the USA in 1975 and lived near Lancaster. To do this, they had to locate and question a huge number of relatives. In Lancaster alone, there were 2,500 people related to the killer by distant kinship. In 2022, the detectives finally found a suitable candidate, 68-year-old David Sinopoli, a man who had never come to the attention of the police in connection with the case. In 1975, he lived in the same complex as the victim, so he immediately became the main suspect. To confirm or refute his involvement, detectives needed to secretly obtain the DNA sample. To do this, they began to follow David, waiting for the right moment. On February 11th, they had such an opportunity. The man flew out to the airport in Philadelphia and, before boarding the flight, threw a paper coffee cup into a bin. The investigators took it and handed it over to the laboratory. Experts extracted his DNA sample and compared it with the semen DNA found on Lindy's underwear. The analysis showed a complete match. David was the killer. He was arrested on July 17, 2022, and is currently awaiting trial. At the time of Lindy's murder, he was 21 years old. He moved into the residential complex a year before the victim moved there with her husband. David was married twice in 1972 and 1987. According to available information, he did not have children. He spent most of his life working at a printing press in a local printing house, and his colleagues were shocked that their good acquaintance turned out to be a ruthless killer. David is now in custody, and additional details will only emerge after the start of the trial. But even now, there is virtually no doubt that he is the killer. Experts also compared his DNA to the blood found in the victim's apartment, and the analysis showed a complete match. Lindy's ex-husband and brother thanked the investigators for being able to uncover the truth, and now the guilty party will be punished. Thus, this complex and convoluted case was solved with the help of innovative technologies almost 47 years later. Genetic genealogy is a unique tool that allows the police to find perpetrators based on the tiniest DNA samples stored for half a century. Karen Slover was born on October 27, 1972, in the American city of Decatur, Illinois. After high school, she attended Richland Community College, where she met her future husband, Michael Slover. After college, they married in 1992, and less than a year later, their son Colton was born. The couple had to work hard to support their child and cover their own expenses. For this reason, Karen had to go back to work for a few days after giving birth. Michael's parents agreed to take care of the child, and he spent most of his working days with them. In the following years, Karen changed several jobs until she settled on the local newspaper. She worked in the advertising department, quickly found common ground with the team, and generally loved her job. A few years after their son's birth, the relationship between the couple began to deteriorate. Karen complained to friends that Michael often lost his temper and hit her during arguments. For this reason, she decided to file for divorce, and the court awarded her custody of Colton. However, she could not afford to hire a nanny for her child since her salary at the newspaper would not cover it. Michael's parents agreed to continue taking care of him while she was at work. After the divorce, she began dating a man named David Swan. They lived separately but saw each other regularly. Swan got along well with her son, and there were no serious problems in their relationship with Karen. In 1996, when her son was already 3 years old, Karen began to think about moving to another city and trying herself as a model. She started looking for suitable vacancies and soon received an invitation from a major modeling company in the state of Georgia. She had been eagerly awaiting the move, but continued to work at the editorial office until the last minute in order to save up money for herself and her son for the first time. On September 27th, Karen left work around 5 p.m., telling her colleagues that she was going to pick up Colton from his grandparents and go to the shopping center with him. The woman planned to attend the wedding of her acquaintance and wanted to buy a suitable dress, but that evening, Karen never picked up her son. Several hours passed and the woman was still missing. She also did not contact her former husband's parents or anyone else. Around 10 p.m. that evening, a patrol officer noticed a suspicious car on the shoulder of Highway 72 near the town of Champaign. The driver's door was open, the headlights were on, and the engine was running. At first, the officer thought that the car had some problems and the driver was trying to fix them. However, as he approached closer, he discovered that there was no one inside the car or nearby. Inside the car, the police found a woman's purse with Karen's documents, a half-eaten chocolate bar, and a package of food from a cafe. Everything looked as if the woman had just left the car and was about to return soon, but she was nowhere to be found. The officer ran the car's license plates and found that it was registered to David Swan. Contacting him, he learned that the man had lent his car to Karen while her car was being repaired. He explained that the woman was supposed to pick up her son from her grandparents that evening, and investigators headed to their home. Meanwhile, the car was taken to the police station, where the forensic experts studied it more closely. Karen's former husband's parents said that the woman was supposed to come right after work, but she never showed up all day. Colton was still there, and his mother could not just leave him without warning. The police began to suspect that the woman may have been abducted or that the car theft did not go as planned. Detectives immediately noticed that the location where the car was found did not match the timeline of events that evening. Karen left the office and headed to her former husband's parents' house before going to the store in Forsyth. Her car was found almost 60 kilometers away. This suggested that the car may have been left there by a criminal who wanted to confuse investigators. The woman herself could not have ended up near another city, as she needed to pick up her son and prepare for a wedding that was supposed to take place the next day. While experts tried to find any clues in the car, such as fingerprints, detectives decided to question employees of stores, hairdressers, and beauty salons in Forsyth. The next day, they went there showing them photos of Karen, but no one had seen her. Forensic experts could not find fingerprints in the car, but something seemed strange to them. On the passenger seat, they found traces of cement and ash. David Swan stated that they were not there when he gave the car to his girlfriend. In addition, several stalks of tall grass were found in the salon, which also raised questions. The car was on the side of the road, along which there was no such vegetation. Moreover, several scattered coins were found in the car, but it did not give them any serious leads. Upon learning of Karen's disappearance, her relatives, colleagues, and friends participated in large-scale searches. Some groups combed the area around the road where her car was found, while others distributed leaflets throughout the city. The management of the newspaper where the women worked offered a reward of $10,000 for any information that would help find her, but all of this did not yield any results. On October 1st, a distressing call came to the police. Fishermen noticed a garbage bag on the shore of Lake Shelbyville, located 50 kilometers from Decatur. It seemed strange to them that someone had left garbage in such a deserted place, so they decided to take it with them to throw away. Later, however, men quickly realized that it was far from garbage. The bag was tightly wrapped in tape and weighed quite a lot, so the fishermen decided to check its contents. To their horror, they saw a woman's head inside. Investigators immediately thought that the victim could be Karen, so they requested her dental records to establish her identity. Their fears were confirmed. The head did indeed belong to her. Meanwhile, police officers and divers searched the lake and soon found several more bags with other parts of Karen's body. Medical experts concluded that the woman died from 7 gunshot wounds, after which an unknown perpetrator dismembered her body using something like a gasoline saw and distributed it in bags. In each of them, there was an additional piece of concrete block to add weight. Detectives assumed that the killer threw the packages from a bridge over the lake. They even managed to find fingerprints on the railings, but these samples were not enough for comparison. In the following days, several more packages surfaced and washed up on the shore, but the police still failed to find all parts of the victim's body. Considering the brutality with which Karen was killed, investigators made a logical conclusion that the perpetrator was likely someone who hated the victim and therefore knew her well. This explained why the criminal fired a total of 7 shots. Based on this, they began looking for possible suspects among her close acquaintances. Friends of the woman told detectives that her ex-husband sometimes beat Karen and often threatened her during their arguments. This immediately aroused suspicions among the investigators, and they decided to question him. Michael said he had been at work all day, as he worked in 3 different places as a security guard at a grocery store, a karate instructor, and a bouncer at a bar. The man finished his shift at the store around 3 p.m., then went straight to the gym where he worked out. After that, he went home, took a shower, and immediately left for work at the bar. Investigators carefully checked his story, but the man really had a solid alibi for the whole day. Many people at all 3 of his workplaces saw him, and detectives specifically highlighted the time frame when Karen left work and when they found her car. Michael had a serious alibi for the whole day, so he was no longer considered a suspect. After that, detectives turned their attention to Karen's boyfriend, and here, everything turned out to be much more interesting. It turned out that David Swan had previously been arrested for assault and had also posed as a police officer. Moreover, the guy had some mental problems which led him to be sent to a psychiatric hospital. After his girlfriend disappeared, he actively participated in the search efforts and did not miss any opportunity to talk to reporters and give interviews. The police considered such behavior slightly suspicious, as David tried to attract as much attention to himself as possible. They suspected that this was the way the man was trying to deflect suspicion, which often happens if the killer is someone close to the victim. This person may be more active than anyone else in the media, calling on the police to find the culprit and generally staying at the center of the investigation. In addition, David misled his friends about his relationship with Karen. He told them that they were going to get married soon, but her friends said the couple had only been dating for a month, and Karen wasn't even thinking about marriage at this stage. Investigators also found out that David owned a chainsaw, which he sometimes used to butcher deer after hunting. Given that Karen's body was dismembered in a similar way, this only strengthened suspicions against him. In addition, the man owned a gun of the same caliber that was used to kill the victim. But the main snag was with his alibi. On the evening of the woman's disappearance, David was supposed to attend his acquaintance's wedding as a chauffeur, but he was very late for the event. As a result, the man had no alibi for about 45 minutes, which coincided with the time of Karen's murder. Taking into account all the above, the detectives were almost certain that he was the killer. The man was questioned for about 4 hours, trying to get a confession out of him. When he began to list literally every action he took that evening, the police heard something interesting. David said he withdrew money from an ATM, and the investigators immediately requested footage from the camera of the machine. To their surprise, this story was confirmed. David did withdraw money at the time that filled the gap in his alibi. The man physically could not have killed Karen and driven the car to another city, so all suspicions were lifted from him. At this point, the detectives had essentially run out of leads. They took one more step that could help them find the killer over time. Tall grass, like the kind found in Karen's car, was often found on abandoned or outlying plots of land. In the city itself, it was constantly mowed down as required by law. The police walked around the outskirts of the city and talked to local residents, asking them to report any strange things they might have seen in this area. The detectives continued to question Karen's relatives and acquaintances in an effort to find new suspects. They found out that the woman had not gotten along with her former mother-in-law, and the relationship had been quite tense at times. Jeanette Slover was very attached to her grandson and did not want to give him up, even to his own mother. Karen sometimes had to forcefully take Colton from their home, and it seemed that Jeanette considered the boy to be her own child rather than her grandchild. But the strangest discovery was yet to come. The police found out that Jeanette had occasionally breastfed Colton. The investigators decided to take a closer look at Slover and spoke with them again. Jeanette claimed that she had been at home with her grandson all day and had tried to call Karen on their home phone when she didn't show up at the appointed time. But the woman didn't answer. The police requested data on calls from their home and found that Slover had never called Karen that day, but instead, their phone had made multiple outgoing calls to their son Michael's number. Karen's former father-in-law told the police that he had left home for less than an hour that evening to buy toys for Colton at a local store. The investigators decided to check this information and found out that the store had never sold toys from that manufacturer. What was even more suspicious was that the man was absent around the same time that Karen was killed. The detectives began to seriously consider Slover's involvement and even identified a possible motive. The victim was planning to move to another state to work as a model, and her son would have gone with her. Considering how attached Jeanette was to Colton, she theoretically could have gone to murder to keep him from being taken away from her. The investigators also found out that Slover had an automotive business. They owned a large plot of land converted into a parking lot for used cars, but it had been practically unused for several years. When the police obtained a search warrant and arrived there, they discovered that the area was littered with broken concrete blocks, just like the ones that had been found in bags with parts of Karen's body. However, the investigators could not confirm that these were the same blocks. In addition, they could not find any evidence, and Slover themselves refused to continue the dialogue with the police and hired a lawyer. At that moment, the investigation had stalled because there were no other leads for the detectives. It was only resumed 2 years later, in 1998, when a new team of detectives decided to re-examine the area where Slover's business was located. They believed that Karen may have been killed there and that some evidence must have been left behind. As for the Slover family themselves, they had all moved to another state during that time. Michael's sister, Mary, had set up Colton and he was living with them. Before the move, they had hired workers to carry out repairs on the business premises. This raised even more suspicions, but without any solid evidence, the detectives were powerless. For the second search in 1998, the investigators enlisted the help of a forensic expert and also sought assistance from the local military base's leadership. They needed as many people as possible to comb through every inch of the area. Over the next 6 months, they collected and sifted through the top layer of soil, searched for traces of blood on every stone until they finally bore fruit. They found a button and rivets from the jeans that Karen was wearing on the day of the murder. Later, they found another button, this time from her blouse. This confirmed the police's theory that the woman's body could have been dismembered and placed in packages on the business premises. The detectives believed that Jeanette, along with her husband, was involved in this, while their daughter Mary was left to babysit Colton. According to their version of events, Jeanette personally shot Karen when she came to pick up her son, after which she and her husband took her body to their business premises. However, the buttons alone were not enough to hold her accountable. The police interviewed all the people who lived near the site and learned that Karen's ex-husband was mowing the grass on the evening after the murder. This only reinforced the investigators' version, according to which Michael not only knew about the crime, but also helped his parents cover up their tracks. Moreover, this confirmed that the site was covered with tall grass, just like Karen's car. Apparently, Jeanette and her husband drove the car away from the city to confuse the investigators, and the grass could have ended up in the car with them. Another witness reported that the Slovers were burning something on the premises on the day of the murder. According to detectives, this is how they got rid of the evidence. But that wasn't all. The most shocking piece of evidence that truly shocked the detectives was found in the packages where they discovered parts of Karen's body. A small black hair was found on the tape used to wrap one of the packages. It turned out to belong to a dog, and Slover happened to have a black Labrador. The detectives obtained a warrant and took hair samples from the Slover's dog brush. DNA analysis showed a complete match, which only strengthened the case against the entire family. Once the police took the brush for analysis, Jeanette and her husband did something that further convinced everyone of their involvement. They immediately put their dog to sleep, apparently fearing they could be accused of the murder through the dog, but they didn't know it was already too late. Gathering all of this evidence together, the police arrested Jeanette, her husband, and son on January 27, 2000. All three were charged with murder, but the family continued to deny any involvement. The case was then brought to trial, which didn't conclude until 2002. Despite all of the evidence and witness testimonies, the jury found them guilty. Michael and his father received 65 years in prison each, while Jeanette received 60 years. In 2003, they attempted to appeal the verdict, but their request was denied by the court. It seemed like the end of the story, but not for Karen's son, who still had to go through some trials of his own. As I mentioned earlier, he was adopted by Michael's sister, Mary. The court made this decision despite Karen's parents also fighting for custody rights.
When Mary's relatives were accused of murder, a logical question arose. Did the woman know that her family members had committed the crime? If she knowingly stayed behind to look after Colton while her mother and father got rid of the body, it would make her an accomplice, but it was practically impossible to prove. Karen's parents still
Went to court, demanding that Mary be stripped of her parental rights and that they be given custody of that boy. A year later, in 2003, the judge ruled in their favor, and Colton remained living with his maternal grandparents. During this process, it was revealed that Mary hated Karen and even told acquaintances several times that she wished her dead. Additionally, the court found that she had tried to make the boy forget about his biological mother in every way possible. At the moment, the whole trio is still serving their punishment. Jeanette will be eligible for early release in 2029 when she will be over 80 years old, while her husband and son will be able to be released after 2030. To this day, they insist on their innocence and try to challenge the verdict, but all these attempts lead to nothing. Mandy Stavik was born on April 16, 1971, in the American city of Bellingham, Washington. She grew up in a large family with loving parents, 2 brothers, and a sister. Soon after Mandy's birth, her parents decided to move to a town called Palmer, Alaska. This place was known for its picturesque nature, safety, and the unity of its few thousand residents. The family lived in this town for several years, but when Mandy was 3 years old, her parents decided to divorce, and she stayed with her mother. Nevertheless, she continued to see her father almost every day. A year later, a terrible tragedy struck their family. Mandy's 17-year-old brother went on a hunting trip and disappeared. The police later found his body, which had almost 20 bullet wounds. Despite all the investigators' efforts to solve the case, they could not find any suspects. For Mandy's family, this event was a real shock, but she continued to grow up joyful and active. She excelled academically, participated in many sports, and played various musical instruments. When Mandy was 12 years old, her mother decided to move back to Washington, but this time to a small village called Acme, whose population at that time was less than 300 people, and all the residents knew each other well. There were practically no serious crimes in this place, and the woman decided that she and her 3 children would be better off there. Mandy enrolled in the local school, quickly made friends, continued to play sports, joined the school music group, and became a cheerleader. In addition, she loved the local nature and enjoyed going for runs towards the picturesque river. When Mandy was 17 years old, another tragedy struck her family. After the divorce, her father stayed in Palmer and started a new family, having several children, and in 1988, Mandy's stepbrother drowned in a river. It was another blow for her and reminded her of her older brother's death. After graduating from high school, Mandy enrolled in Central Washington University in 1989, which was 3 hours away from her home. She wanted to become a pilot and strove to get straight A's. She lived in a dormitory, but whenever she had the chance, she visited her family. At the end of November, she came home to spend Thanksgiving with her relatives and planned to stay there for a few more days. On November 24th, the day after the holiday, Mandy decided to go for a run. Usually, her mother accompanied her and rode her bike next to her, but this time she stayed home because her sister had come to visit her briefly. So Mandy set off alone, taking the family's German Shepherd with her. Her usual route started from home and ran along the road to the river, after which she turned around and ran back, totaling about 5 kilometers. Usually the run took less than an hour, but this time Mandy was clearly delayed. When her brother returned home, he was surprised that Mandy was still not back. He was visiting a friend whose house was located along the road. The brother saw Mandy run back towards home, but after a few minutes, she ran in the opposite direction. He thought she had decided to do another lap, but even considering that, she should have returned home much earlier than him. As time passed, Mandy's relatives began to worry seriously about her. In addition to the fact that she had never run for so long before, she had plans for the evening. Before heading home for the holiday, she invited her dorm mate, who came with her. They were planning to go to a neighboring town that day to meet with friends. 2 hours later, something happened that made the whole family worry even more. Their German Shepherd returned home without Mandy, which was extremely strange. The mother of a young woman who had already lost a child once decided to immediately contact the police, and despite Mandy being 18 years old, the sheriff agreed to start the search right after the woman's call. Meanwhile, the mother began calling literally every resident of the village and asking if they had seen her daughter. Upon hearing that Mandy had disappeared, many of them went out into the street and quickly organized their own search. Together with the young woman's relatives, they walked along the route she had run several times, but she was not found. Meanwhile, the police began questioning people close to Mandy. They learned that the young woman had a boyfriend named Rick, whom she had been dating since high school. The young woman's mother also said that the couple had broken up and gotten back together again. The investigators spoke with him, but found no reason to suspect the young man. They questioned several other people while combing the area with the villagers. By that time, people on SUVs, horses, and helicopters had joined the search. The local dog handler even tried to work with a shepherd dog, hoping that it would lead them to Mandy. However, the dog was clearly frightened and did not want to leave the porch of its house. The search continued until late at night, but it yielded no results. The next day it continued, and the police managed to find the first worrying clue. Volunteers found women's sports pants on one of the back roads. They were covered in mud, looked old, and had several holes. The pants were immediately shown to Mandy's mother, but she hesitated to say that they belonged to her daughter. Despite this, the police still sent them to the laboratory. Experts found traces of male semen on them. Detectives immediately asked for DNA samples from all the men who were familiar with Mandy and were in the area, but no matches were found. The FBI's general database, which contains DNA of convicted criminals, did not exist yet that year, so investigators could not do anything with this clue. Meanwhile, specialists with search dogs began to participate in the search, and soon they discovered a new lead. They managed to find traces of the young woman on the dirt road, as well as the tracks of her sheepdog. But there was one strange moment. Their tracks stopped at the same place. From this, only one conclusion could be drawn. Mandy must have gotten into someone's car. Detectives suggested that she may have been abducted and forced into a car, but experts disproved this assumption, as there would have been a different scene at the point where the tracks ended, as the young woman should have resisted. In reality, it looked as though she got into the car of her own accord, meaning that the driver could have been someone she knew. On the third day of the search, police, along with firefighters, began searching the nearby river that flowed alongside the road where the young woman was last seen. There, they made a distressing discovery. About 5 kilometers downstream from the village, they noticed a female body in the water. After retrieving it, they immediately realized that it was Mandy, as she was naked except for her socks and sneakers. The police did not see any serious injuries, except for several large scratches on her legs. In connection with this, they began to speculate if the young woman could have drowned. But this version made no sense. Firstly, it was the end of November, and the water in the river was very cold, so Mandy could not have gone into it voluntarily, especially without clothes. In addition, the depth of the river in that place was significantly lower than human height, and the young woman could have stood there safely. Medical experts examined the victim's body and found a head injury, which was most likely caused by a strong blow. However, they determined that this injury could not have been the cause of death. In the end, the experts concluded that the young woman died of suffocation in the water. In other words, she drowned. In addition, the medical experts found evidence of violence against the victim and were able to extract biological material from the perpetrator, as well as detect male DNA under the victim's fingernails. Based on all this, the police developed the most likely version of what happened. Someone kidnapped Mandy on the road, dragged her into a car, and drove her to the river, where an unknown perpetrator subjected her to violence. After that, the young woman managed to escape, evidenced by the scratches on her legs, most likely caused by prickly vegetation along the riverbank. At some point, the criminal caught up to Mandy, hit her on the head, and threw her into the water. Forensic experts identified a DNA profile and compared it to samples from everyone who was in any way connected to the case. In total, they checked over 30 men, but no matches were found. Police continued to search for any leads by questioning all residents of the village and surrounding areas. Apart from Mandy's brother, another Acme resident saw her on the day of her disappearance. The man parked near his house and saw the young woman running along the road. When she disappeared from view, a dark pickup truck drove past. At that moment, the man did not attach any importance to it, but after Mandy's murder, he shared his observation with the police. He could not remember the model of the pickup truck and refused to provide detectives with his DNA sample. This behavior seemed suspicious, and they obtained a court order to compel the man to give his DNA. However, it did not match the sample found on the victim's body. The murder received active media coverage, and in the first 3 months, police received several thousand tips. Unfortunately, they all led to dead ends, and as a result, the investigation dragged on for years. Detectives were unable to identify any serious suspects, although they continued to actively consider various candidates. At some point, investigators speculated that an unknown serial killer known as the Green River Killer might be behind the crime. He was suspected of killing dozens of young women, and he often dumped their bodies in rivers. However, no evidence in favor of this version was found. Even when the killer was caught and his identity became known, investigators could not link him to Mandy's murder. Due to the lack of evidence and new suspects, the investigation of this case stopped for many years. Periodically, detectives retrieved it from the archives, trying to find some fresh ideas, but it did not produce any results. In 2009, 20 years after Mandy's death, a new detective from the local police department reopened the investigation. Given that no new evidence had emerged over the past 2 decades, he decided to take a different approach. Together with his colleagues, they went around the entire village and surrounding areas, asking every male resident to provide their DNA sample. The detective's plan was quite simple. He understood that the killer of Mandy was most likely a local resident, and if they collected DNA samples, from literally every man, there was a decent chance of finding the culprit among them. Considering that there were only a few hundred men living in the village and its surroundings, this task seemed quite straightforward. But in practice, it turned out to be much more difficult. It took the police a whole 4 years to check all the men, and in the end, they didn't get a single match. The detectives realized that in 20 years since the murder, the killer could have moved somewhere else or even died. So they began to dig through archives and try to track down literally every man who lived in the area at the time of 1989. In 2013, the police received an unexpected lead. 2 women who grew up in the same village as Mandy went to a water park with their children. As they chatted, they remembered the infamous murder and began to discuss it. At some point, one of the women said that she suspected who might have killed Mandy. The other replied that she also suspected a specific person. And they both named the same name, Timothy Bass. At the time of the murder, he was 21 years old and lived just a few houses away from the victim. The women were shocked that they had been suspecting the same person all this time. But even more interesting were the reasons why they considered Timothy to be the culprit. One of the women said that Timothy had been hitting on her when they were teenagers. Once, when she was in a car with Timothy and some other friends, he began to aggressively pursue her and make advances. The other friends intervened, and since then, the woman had been seriously afraid of being near this person. The second woman's story was even more shocking. Several years after Mandy's murder, when the woman was already living with her husband and their newborn baby, Timothy knocked on her door one evening while her husband was at work. The woman was not surprised by his visit since he and her husband were friends. Timothy said that he had been passing by after hunting and needed to use the phone. The woman let him in, but Timothy started to behave strangely. Instead of making a call, he stood there with the phone in his hand and then put it down. He then began to tell the woman that he had been in love with her for a long time and offered to engage in a sexual relationship. She refused and demanded that he leave, but Timothy continued to insist, aggressively. The woman then threatened to call the police, and only after that did he leave their home. Sharing these stories, they decided to go to the police together and talk about their suspicions about Timothy. When asked why they waited so long, the women replied that they were not sure of his involvement in the murder. In such a small community, they would never be forgiven if they accused an innocent person of murder, so none of them dared to share this information. Detectives immediately became interested in this person and noticed something interesting. During the initial investigation, none of their colleagues interviewed Timothy or asked him to provide a DNA sample. This was very strange. The young man did not appear in old police reports despite being acquainted with the victim, living nearby, and his house being next to the same road that the young woman ran on. Digging deeper, investigators also found that Mandy was friends with his younger brother, Tom. Another suspicious moment was that Timothy moved to another city less than 2 months after the murder. Perhaps this was the reason why the guy remained out of the police's sight. At that time, they were busy with a huge amount of leads and checking people who voluntarily cooperated with them. Timothy settled in the town of Emerson, located 40 kilometers from his old home. Shortly before moving, he married and eventually had 3 children. Opening his criminal history, detectives found another alarming fact. In 2010, his wife filed a statement with the police that Timothy had beaten her and their children, but the investigators were most surprised by one small detail contained in this statement. In it, his wife described why Timothy was a danger to their family. Among the stories of domestic violence, she briefly mentioned her husband's strange behavior. While watching documentary crime films, when they watched similar programs together, Timothy constantly criticized criminals for how poorly they commit murders, leaving behind a lot of evidence. The man also loved to say that he would never make the same mistakes and would not have been caught. After studying all this information, the detectives began to seriously consider his involvement in Mandy's murder. They went to his house to ask a series of questions and request a voluntary DNA sample. And that's when the most interesting part began. Timothy claimed that he did not remember the crime and could not even remember who Mandy Stavik was. This statement immediately made detectives doubt his words. First of all the residents of the village, with a population of less than 300, knew each other. Secondly, Timothy lived just a few houses away from the Stavik family, and it was simply impossible to imagine that he did not know her. Moreover, after the murder, this case was talked about not only in the village itself, but also in all neighboring towns. It was the first such crime in the area in many years, and for local residents, this topic remained number one for many months. Therefore, detectives did not hurry to believe the man's words, and they asked him to provide a DNA sample. But Timothy refused, which aroused even more suspicion. Unfortunately, they had absolutely no evidence that could link him to the murder, so investigators could not obtain a court order that would require the man to provide his DNA. Then they decided to go another way. Detectives found out that Timothy had worked as a courier at a bakery located in a neighboring town for many years. They went there and talked to the manager, asking him to provide them with information about Timothy's routes for the next few days. The police planned to track him and get some item on which the man could leave his DNA. They did not tell the manager which particular crime their employee was suspected of. Detectives only said that an investigation was underway, but the woman refused to provide this information without the permission of higher management. The police contacted them and they demanded a court order. Thus, investigators were again at a dead end. They continued to study Timothy's biography and try to find new clues that would allow them to obtain the much-needed court decision, but all their attempts led to nothing, and the case was stalled for several more years. In 2015, the police came to his house again, asked a few questions, and requested a DNA sample, but he refused again. It continued until 2017, when something unexpected happened. A woman named Kim Wagner, who was a manager at the bakery, went to a bar with her husband and friends, all of whom used to live in Acme and were around the same age as Mandy when she was murdered. At some point, they started talking about the case, which had haunted the locals for decades. Suddenly, one of the friends mentioned Timothy Bass, who lived near the victim's home, and it dawned on Kim when the police came to her workplace and asked for information about his whereabouts. She didn't even think it could be related to Mandy Stavik's murder. And then Kim started thinking that her colleague was the killer. This thought stayed with her for a long time. At some point, detectives came to her workplace again, hoping that she had changed her position since their previous conversation, and their hope was justified. Kim invited the investigators to her office and asked directly, "Do they suspect Timothy of killing Mandy?" The police were surprised but did not deny it, and then the woman provided them with all the necessary information and interesting observations about her colleague. She had known the man for many years and always found him strange. When one of her friends mentioned that Bass lived near Mandy's home during those years, she began to seriously consider his involvement in the case, so she decided to help the investigators. The detectives started following Timothy, and new difficulties emerged. He always wore gloves at work, which prevented experts from taking a DNA sample from objects he touched. The man also did not smoke, so the police could not even obtain a cigarette butt with his saliva. Bass did not even have a workplace in the bakery since he worked exclusively on delivering products. In addition, another strange fact complicated the investigator's task. Timothy never threw away his garbage at work. He stored it in his van and took it home. The detectives immediately realized that such behavior could not be a coincidence. Apparently, Timothy understood that the police suspected him of Mandy's murder and started making sure that they did not get any items with his DNA. But in the end, the detectives were lucky to find out that they couldn't obtain the suspect's biological material. Kim offered to help. Laws work in such a way that police officers are not allowed to ask third parties to obtain evidence for them. In such a case, the evidence will not be admissible in court, even if the suspect's guilt is obvious. However, if any person voluntarily hands over evidence to the investigators, they have the right to accept and use it. Thus, Kim offered to obtain some DNA samples from Bass, and the detectives waited. The suspect was very careful, and it took the woman a long time to achieve her goal. Only after 3 months did she see the man drink Coke from a plastic cup and then throw it away in the trash with the can. Kim waited until Timothy left, took both pieces of evidence, and handed them over to the police. They immediately sent the can with the cup to the laboratory, and the experts extracted a DNA profile from them. It fully matched the biological material found on Mandy's body. Having finally obtained the long-awaited evidence, the police immediately went after the man and arrested him. 28 years after the murder, the suspect was finally charged. During the interrogation, Timothy denied his guilt until the investigators told him about the DNA sample match. Hearing this, the man immediately changed his story and said that he and Mandy had a secret affair. They supposedly started dating many months before her murder and had to hide their relationship from everyone because she had a boyfriend. According to Timothy, on the day of her death, Mandy came to his house during her jog. They had an intimate encounter, and she left. He added that his father was at home at the time, but it was impossible to use him as a witness since he had passed away long ago. The detectives did not believe this story for a second. In their opinion, Timothy made up the whole story about the secret affair just to explain the presence of his DNA on the victim's body. Moreover, as proof of his words, he referred to his deceased father, who could not refute this information. Investigators talked to Mandy's relatives and friends, and they all expressed complete confidence that the young woman would never date Timothy. He was very strange, avoided communication with other people, and spent most of his time alone. The detectives decided to speak with Timothy's wife. Despite the fact that the woman had filed statements against her husband and lived separately, they were still married. Here, the police were waiting for another interesting turn. The woman suddenly said that on the day of Mandy's murder, she was with Timothy at his house and he was there all day. The detectives did not believe her story, but her words created possible difficulties for the court. On the other hand, they contradicted Timothy's version, according to which Mandy came to his house on the day of the murder and had an intimate relationship with him. The trial began in May 2019. Timothy's lawyer continued to insist that his client was innocent and that his DNA got on the victim's body as a result of a consensual intimate contact. The prosecution, however, insisted that there was no evidence to support this version. Timothy never called Mandy, never wrote her notes or letters, and no one among the witnesses saw them together. It was much more likely that Bass had a one-sided crush on the young woman and was even obsessed with her. Investigators found out that the guy started attending all the sports matches when Mandy joined the school team. Before that, he had absolutely no interest in sports. In addition, his windows overlooked the road where the young woman was running, and he could watch her during her runs. Apparently, that day, he decided to talk to her and caught up with her. Perhaps the guy started to harass Mandy, but the young woman resisted, or he persuaded her to get into his car on some pretext. Later, Bass took her to a deserted place, subjected her to violence, and then the young woman managed to escape. The guy caught up with her near the riverbank, hit her on the head with some object, and threw her body into the water. Timothy's wife testified as a witness in court, who by that time had already divorced him, and this time she surprised everyone again. Instead of sticking to her original story, the woman told a new one. According to her, she did not remember that she was at Timothy's house on the day of the murder. The woman added that Bass had forced her to lie to the police during the first interrogation, otherwise he could go to jail. At that time, she seriously feared that her husband might harm her or her children, so she agreed to lie to the police. This deprived the suspect of his only alibi, but the court heard even more interesting details. Tom's younger brother told that after Timothy was asked for a DNA sample, he started to get very anxious about it. When Tom asked him what was going on, his brother told him the same story about a secret affair with the victim. Timothy also asked him to tell the police that he had also had a sexual relationship with Mandy, but Tom refused to lie. Even Timothy's own mother testified against him when she visited him in jail, and he passed her a note asking her to lie to the police that they had gone to the store together on the day of the murder to buy Christmas gifts, but she refused to lie. In the note, Timothy also asked her to testify against his own father and try to convince investigators that he was the real killer. After all this, the defendant's lawyer tried to convince the jurors that Timothy's DNA sample had been obtained illegally. He insisted that the police had asked a civilian to obtain the man's biological material outside the rules. However, Kim Wagner refuted these claims and said that she had offered her help to the police. In 1989, this murder deeply shook her, and she continued to think about it regularly for decades. Learning that her colleague was a suspect, she wanted to help solve the case. Moreover, by that time, she already had a daughter, and Kim could barely imagine what Mandy's mother felt during those years. The trial lasted several weeks, and after all the evidence presented, the jury found Timothy Bass guilty of murder. He was sentenced to 27 years in prison, with the possibility of applying for early release after 24 years. Mandy's mother, who was 83 years old at the time, thanked the detectives for their work. Although she had lost 2 children in her life, she was still glad that the guilty party had been punished. In 1990, Mandy's relatives established a scholarship in her name at the high school where she attended. They continue to support this program to this day, annually awarding the most talented students who study music. The foundation of this scholarship was $25,000 collected by the residents of Acme and other towns. Initially, this money was offered as a reward for information, but after the case was solved, it was decided to put it into this program.
Mime Lin and Yun Lin had immigrated to Australia from China to pursue higher education. They met during their time at the University of Sydney and later got married, establishing their permanent residence in North Epping. In 1994, their daughter Jun Lin, commonly known as Brenda, was born, and she was soon joined by 2 sons, Henry and Terry. In 2002, the Lin family opened a kiosk on Rose Street, selling various news publications, newspapers, and magazines. Gradually, their small business began to prosper and generate a substantial income. The family was highly respected within the community, known for their hard work, as their store operated 7 days a week, and they were seen as loving and caring parents. Their eldest daughter, Brenda, grew up to be beautiful, intelligent, and kind. Henry was very sociable and had a strong interest in sports, while the youngest, Terry, kept up with his older siblings. The strong family bonds were reflected in their outward success as their business thrived. The family's income from the store had already reached around $1 million per year, making the Line family one of the most prosperous and respected in North Epping. Having achieved success in their business, Min Line and Yun Line assisted a relative from China in relocating to Australia. Irene, Lily's sister, had been living in the same house as her sister and her family since her move to Australia, helping to raise the children. Min Line organized the relocation of his parents, and the elderly couple settled in Maryland's, located a 30-minute drive from North Epping. He also helped his sister Kathy and her husband, Leon bin Agzi, known as Robert, with their move. Kathy and Robert, after an unsuccessful attempt to start their own restaurant business, settled in North Epping, living just a few minutes' walk from the Line family's home, and both of them worked at Min Line's store. On the morning of July 18, 2009, the store's regular customers were alarmed to find it closed without any prior notice. This was highly unusual since the store had always been open 7 days a week. Concerned about this, one of the store's loyal patrons contacted Kathy to inquire about
the reason for the store's closure. Kathy, unaware of why her brother hadn't shown up for work and failed to notify anyone, suspected that Min Line might be ill. In response, Kathy and her husband went to her brother's home. Upon approaching the house, they discovered the front door unlocked. Inside the house, when they reached the second floor, they were met with a gruesome
crime scene involving the Line family. Kathy immediately reported the discovery to the police, leading to the revelation of the Line family's demise. Police swiftly arrived at the scene and found the lifeless bodies of 43-year-old Yun Line, commonly known as Lily, her two sons Henry, aged 12, and Terry, aged 12, and Terry, aged 9, as well as her 39-year-old sister Yun Bin, known as Irene. Blood splatters were discovered throughout the house, from floor to ceiling. In the initial hours of the investigation, the police became suspicious of Min Lin, the head of the family, as his body was not found. During the examination of the house, investigators also noted the absence of another family member, the eldest daughter of Jun Lin, known as Brenda. Upon inspecting the crime scene, it became apparent that the assailant had not entered her room, as there were no traces of blood and the room remained untouched. 2 hours after the police arrived at the scene, a man's body was discovered under a blanket on a bed next to Lily, indicating that Min Lin, the family's head, was not a fugitive but had become a victim of the attack. To ascertain the identities of the deceased, investigators had to turn to forensic examination, as their faces were so disfigured that their relatives could not identify them. The police began a thorough examination of every corner of the crime scene, but at that point, they had no leads regarding the motive for the crime or the identity of the perpetrator. Initially, upon examining the bodies, investigators believed that the assailant had shot the victims in the face from close range, given the extent of their disfigurement. However, later, the results of a forensic examination revealed that the victims had been brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt, heavy object, likely a hammer. Additionally, 4 out of the 5 victims exhibited signs of asphyxiation, indicating that they had been strangled before succumbing to their injuries. The time of death was estimated to be between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. Police learned that on the evening of Friday, July 17, 2009, a large family dinner had been organized at Min Line's parents' home, attended by the entire family, including Kathy and Robert. According to the parents' accounts, the dinner had proceeded in a warm and pleasant atmosphere, with everyone enjoying their time together. The only family member absent was Brenda Lynn, who was 15 years old at the time. She had left on a school trip to study the French language in New Caledonia with Cheltenham Girls High School, and had learned about the brutal murder of her entire family through Facebook. This incident created a media frenzy and shocked the community. Many North Epping residents were personally acquainted with the Line family and were deeply saddened by their tragic demise.
The public funeral for the Line family took place at Olympic Park on August 8, 2009, with over 1,000 people coming to bid farewell to the family. After the funeral, despite Line's parents offering Brenda to live with them, Kathy and Robert insisted on taking custody of the girl, citing their advanced age, and swiftly formalized guardianship. Brenda returned to school, and Kathy and Robert took over the management of the store. The police continued their investigation, which was filled with rumors and speculations. One theory suggested that the initial intention of the perpetrator might have been a robbery gone awry. Another theory implied a connection to the Chinese mafia, as a few days prior to the murder, Mainlin had witnessed an armed robbery of a cash-in-transit vehicle near his store. It was believed that he was killed to prevent him from testifying, and the rest of the family became unintended victims. However, the investigation could not find any evidence linking the crime to the robbery witnessed by Mainlin. The idea of a home invasion was also swiftly ruled out, as there were no signs of forced entry, and nothing had been stolen from the house. During the investigation, it became evident that the murders had been meticulously planned. The absence of any foreign fingerprints in the house, except those of the family members, led investigators to believe that the killer likely wore gloves. Given that the murder weapon was not found at the crime scene, investigators concluded that the perpetrator had carefully planned the crime and had taken steps to dispose of the murder weapon. Detectives hypothesized that, to maintain control and prevent the hammer from being dropped during the attack, the assailant likely had it attached to their wrist in some way. At the crime scene, 24 bloody shoe prints were discovered, which were determined to correspond to a shoe size of 9. 5 in American measurements, indicating that the assailant acted alone. Investigators speculated that the crime was most likely committed by someone close to the family, who had access to the house, was familiar with the layout of the rooms, knew the location of the circuit breaker and alarm system, and was aware of Brenda's absence from the house. This idea was supported by the fact that the killer did not enter Brenda's room, as no traces of blood were found in there. The brutality of the crime led investigators to consider that it was driven either by intense hatred or overwhelming passion. Despite their suspicions, investigators still had no concrete idea of who might be involved in this crime. Extensive interrogations of potential witnesses yielded no valuable information. Mainlin's parents, as well as Kathy and Robert, were questioned multiple times, but no significant information regarding potential wrongdoers was obtained. Kathy and Robert held a press conference organized by the police, urging the public to share any information they might have about the case. However, for several months, the investigation seemed to be at a standstill. The immense public pressure on the police demanded a swift resolution to find and punish the perpetrator. Consequently, a special task force was established within the police department, consisting of the most experienced investigators. They decided to re-examine all the evidence in the case that had not been thoroughly analyzed before. During the review of a recorded phone call between Kathy and the emergency services operator, towards the end of the call, the police noticed some unintelligible muttering in the Cantonese dialect. This recording was quickly translated, revealing a woman pleading with her husband not to leave her alone in the house because she suspected the perpetrator might still be inside. Investigators found it peculiar that Robert had left his wife alone at the crime scene, without checking whether the assailant was still in the house or not. This raised suspicions that he might have known for certain that she was safe and that the assailant had already left the premises. As a result, investigators decided to scrutinize Robert more closely, shifting the focus of the investigation in this direction and searching for additional evidence. During their investigation, detectives discovered that Robert had unrestricted access to the Line family home, as he had a key to it. Furthermore, he had a motive for committing the crime. After moving to North Epping, Robert struggled to establish himself in a business and had to work as an employee for Line. Following the Line family's death, all of their assets were transferred to Brenda, but as she was only 15 years old at the time, the legal guardianship of the girl meant that Kathy and Robert had control over all the family's assets and business. Police learned that almost immediately after taking custody of Brenda, Robert pressured Mainlin's parents to vacate the house that Minlin had purchased for them. Police suspected that Robert, humiliated by his own failures and driven by jealousy, harbored a plan to seize the fortune accumulated by the Lin family through years of hard work. Despite Robert being the primary suspect in the case, the police only had suspicions against him. In the hope of obtaining more substantial evidence, investigators installed surveillance cameras in his residence as part of a covert operation that continued for 6 months. In May 2010, during another round of questioning with Kathy, investigators intentionally broached the topic of the bloody shoe prints found in the house. She disclosed that Robert wore Asics shoes in size 9.5. This revelation was a breakthrough for the investigation because the Asics shoe model was rare, as it had been discontinued in 2005, and these shoe prints were discovered at the crime scene. Just a few days after this, Robert was caught on hidden cameras inside his home, cutting up several Asics shoe boxes, moistening the torn cardboard bits in a bucket of water, and flushing them down the toilet. Armed with this information from the surveillance cameras, the police obtained a search warrant for Robert's house. During the search, investigators discovered a stain marked as number 91 on the garage floor beneath a chest of drawers. Subsequent laboratory analysis revealed that this stain was human blood containing a complex mixture of DNA, including at least 4 out of the 5 victims. Experts also determined that the composition of this stain matched the blood found in the victim's house. On May 5, 2011, almost 2 years after the committed crime, Robert was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He was remanded in custody without the possibility of bail. His trial did not begin until May 2014, and he pleaded not guilty to the charges against him. The prosecution presented a wealth of new evidence against Robert. One of the most crucial pieces of evidence in the case was the testimony of an informant from prison who revealed that while awaiting trial, Robert had confessed to him. He admitted that on the night of the murders to leave his house without his wife noticing, he had given her a large dose of sedatives. Additionally, he shared that he had purchased the murder weapon, a hammer, from a budget store in town, knowing that the store had dummy surveillance cameras, ensuring there would be no evidence of the purchase. Robert also confessed to his cellmate that he had struggled to dispose of the hammer for a while, fearing he might be caught on surveillance camera recordings. Robert's defense attempted to convince the jurors to disregard these testimonies, suggesting that the witness may have had ulterior motives, such as reducing their own prison sentence in exchange for their testimony. In the end, the entire body of evidence came down to the informant's words against Robert's consistent denials. Despite the compelling evidence in the case, it seemed like the trial might fall apart and the court would not reach a verdict. However, a sudden and unpleasant revelation during the trial changed the course of the investigation. Brenda confessed to her attorney that Robert had subjected her to sexual abuse for many years, starting when he and his wife moved to Sydney and her family was still alive. When the girl moved into his home after her parents' death, his advances only intensified. This revelation led to the suspension of the trial for further investigation and the uncovering of these newly disclosed facts. Several months later, in August 2014, the second trial began. The prosecution now argued that Robert was driven not only by jealousy and greed, but also by a sexual obsession with his niece. Despite all the evidence against Robert, the defense continued to assert that he was a victim of public pressure on the police. They also cast doubt on the nature and timing of the garage bloodstain, suggesting that it could have entered the garage floor after Robert and Kathy discovered the bodies at the crime scene, and Robert might have accidentally stepped on blood while wearing the same shoes. Ultimately, this trial was postponed due to the judge's illness. In February 2015, the third trial began, which again led to no conclusive verdict as the jurors failed to reach a unanimous decision. In December of the same year, Robert was released on bail after spending nearly 5 years in prison without a conviction. The fourth trial began in June 2016, and once again, the jurors could not reach a unanimous decision. It wasn't until January 12, 2017, during the fifth hearing of the case, that the court delivered a guilty verdict, sentencing Robert to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. In June 2020, Robert filed an appeal, which was denied in February 2021. He is currently behind bars, but has never admitted his guilt in committing this crime. Marie Collins, residing in the city of Perth, Western Australia, was a respected elderly woman in the community. She was highly regarded among the local church community, of which she was an active participant. Marie was known for her kindness and responsiveness, always ready to help those in need. An elegant woman with refined taste and a keen understanding of fashion trends, she also worked part-time at a nearby clothing store. Marie lived in her own apartment, consisting of 4 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, with a beautiful balcony view. The apartment was located in the prestigious Washington Gardens area on Leonard Street, southeast of downtown Perth. Unfortunately, Marie's husband passed away in 2001 when he was still quite young, leaving her childless. Despite this, she led a very active life, and her home was a welcoming place for her numerous friends and relatives. In 2020, Marie decided to renovate her residence, demonstrating her proficiency in new technologies and being well acquainted with various gadgets and computers. She regularly communicated with friends and family through social media. Therefore, they became deeply concerned when, on Easter Sunday, April 12, 2020, they received no messages from her. Attempts to contact her by phone went unanswered. The day before, on Saturday, April 11th, Marie had coffee at a cafe near her home, visited the beach, and saw her sister Helen Batheine. She returned home around noon and sent a message with peculiar content. "Hello, Helen. Sorry for not answering your call. I'm not feeling well and I've lost my voice." After 1 p.m., she ceased all communication. Losing contact with her sister, Helen Batheine, who was concerned about her silence, called her brother Wayne Johnson, who lived just a few blocks away from Marie with his 12-year-old son and could visit his sister to find out what was going on. Worried, Wayne texted Marie and also received no response. He told Helen that he was heading to Marie's place and would stay in constant communication, but after a while, he too stopped answering phone calls and SMS. Growing even more alarmed, Helen decided to go to her sister's apartment, asking her son-in-law to accompany her. When they approached the residential complex, they saw Marie in Wayne's cars in the parking lot, a troubling sign. Meeting Marie's neighbor and sharing their concerns and suspicions, all 3 went to the woman's apartment. Helen had a spare key to her sister's apartment, and all 3 easily entered. However, when they crossed the threshold, a horrifying scene unfolded before them. The apartment was drenched in blood, knives, latex gloves, a large piece of tarpaulin, beer bottles, and protein shake containers were scattered around. Most importantly, they saw the lifeless bodies of Marie and Wayne lying on the floor. In a state of shock, all 3 immediately left the apartment and called the police, who arrived promptly and began the investigation. Upon examining the apartment, investigators confirmed that Marie and Wayne had been subjected to a very brutal attack. Bloody shoe prints were found all over the floor, and the broken and scattered furniture throughout the apartment indicated that the victims had resisted their assailant. A thorough inspection revealed that the likely weapons used in the bloody massacre were 2 sets of handcuffs, a stun gun, a bread knife, a large hunting knife, and a letter opener. Medical experts determined that Marie had suffered 12 knife wounds and a throat cut, while Wayne had 25 knife wounds and at least 10 stab wounds. Additionally, on the handle of the bloodied stun gun, DNA belonging to both Marie Collins and the presumed murderer was found. Commencing the investigation on hot leads, the police discovered that there were no signs of forced entry into the apartment. Given that the apartment was on the 8th floor, the theory of the perpetrator entering through a window seemed unlikely. Detectives formulated 2 hypotheses regarding the killer's entry into the residence. Either the perpetrator had their own key, or Marie was acquainted with the individual and trusted them enough to let them into the apartment. Investigators began questioning Marie's friends and relatives to determine their whereabouts at the time of the crime. They also interviewed neighbors who lived nearby. The police conducted a thorough inspection of the surrounding area and the parking lot,
jotting down the license plate numbers of parked cars and peering inside through windows. In one of the vehicles, a receipt from a local hardware store issued on Saturday, April 11th at 1843 was discovered. The receipt listed items such as blue tarpaulin and rope. Checking the car's registration number against the database, investigators identified the owner as 29-year-old Luke Fawcett, who resided in the same building as the attack's victims. In Luke Fawcett's police record, data on 2 convictions for possession of controlled substances and several traffic violations were found, but nothing more. Suspecting Luke Fawcett's involvement in the crime, detectives began surveillance and learned that on the day of Marie and Wayne's murder, Luke sought medical assistance at a hospital. His grandmother had driven him there after he informed her that he had injured himself with a knife while falling down a staircase. The police invited Luke to the station for questioning, where he denied any involvement in the crime and willingly provided a DNA sample. At this stage, investigators lacked sufficient grounds for the suspect's arrest, so they continued their search for evidence. Police reviewed surveillance camera footage at the hardware store, discovering that on Saturday evening, April 11th, around 20:43, Luke appeared on camera purchasing rope and blue tarpaulin. Additionally, one of the neighbors confirmed seeing a man behaving suspiciously near his apartment on that day, walking back and forth in the corridor, crying, sighing, and the neighbor took a photo of him, revealing Luke. DNA samples from the suspect were soon obtained, and they matched the blood traces in Marie's apartment. This crucial evidence led to Luke's official arrest on April 13, 2020, for the murders of Marie Collins and Wayne Johnson. Continuing their investigation, the police found out that Luke Fawcett was a reserved boy in his childhood with very few friends. Despite this, he managed to graduate from school with one of the top results in his class and enrolled at the University of Western Australia, where he studied psychology. He juggled his studies while working part-time at a nightclub. On the surface, Luke made a very positive impression. He appeared to be a successful and friendly young man. After completing his education, Luke began working in a disability support service. He also had a girlfriend, and they were planning to move in together. Luke's career was on an upward trajectory. He rapidly climbed the professional ladder, earning trust and respect from those around him. He had every chance to defend his degree in psychology. For several years, Luke rented a 1-bedroom apartment in the same building where Marie Collins lived, and they had developed good neighborly relations. He occasionally visited her, helped with household chores, rearranged furniture in the apartment, and taught her computer skills. However, at the beginning of 2020, several unpleasant incidents occurred in Luke's life that seriously impacted the course of events. It all began with Luke experiencing frequent panic attacks, losing satisfaction from his work, and being diagnosed with anxiety disorder and depression. His behavior became increasingly strange. After quarreling with colleagues at work, he resigned, leading to a complete breakdown in his relationship with his girlfriend. Faced with ongoing health and relationship issues, Luke turned to alcohol and illicit substances, combining them with antidepressant medication. Losing his steady income, he began facing financial difficulties, stopped paying for accommodation, and was at risk of being evicted from his apartment. After obtaining a search warrant for Luke Fawcett's apartment and car, as well as seizing his phone, the police continued their investigation, and what they found there left everyone in shock. It turned out that Marie's murder was not a random act. Luke had been planning it for a long time. 2 handwritten notes, both authored by Fawcett, were discovered in the apartment. One was labeled as a to-do list detailing what and how he should execute, and the other was titled Equipment, listing items required for the crime, such as silent shoes, a baseball bat, cable ties, pepper spray, a stun gun, and handcuffs.
Investigators also found that a week before the murder, the young man had purchased a shovel at the same hardware store. In the confiscated mobile phone, a video recorded approximately 2 weeks earlier was found, showing Luke Fawcett dressed in a black suit and mask, holding a knife in one hand and a stun gun in the other, seemingly rehearsing the impending murder.
Files with recordings made during the actual murder were also discovered on the phone, with names like interrogation, beating, pepper spray to the eyes, etc. Additionally, a screenshot of a map was found, leading the police to a forest approximately 200 kilometers south of Perth, where a freshly dug grave was discovered. Luke had prepared it in advance for his victim, along with a shovel and a black bag containing the same protein shake bottles found in Marie Collins's apartment. During the court proceedings, Fawcett denied his involvement in his neighbor's death and claimed he found her body wrapped in blue tarpaulin at her home. He asserted that an unknown man, who also attacked him, was the real killer. However, he admitted to stabbing Wayne Johnson, alleging self-defense, as Wayne attacked him after seeing his sister's lifeless body, mistakenly believing that Luke was the perpetrator and began choking him. He explained his shoulder injury, sustained during their altercation, through this confrontation with Wayne Johnson. Fawcett told the court that he hesitated to call the police because he feared nobody would believe him. "I was afraid that I would be blamed for the deaths of both these people," he said. Regarding the video found on his phone, Luke claimed it was part of a role-playing video game, and the threatening videos and shopping lists were unrelated to the murder that occurred in his neighbor's apartment. The prosecution, however, was adamant, asserting that it was Luke Fawcett who, in the second half of the day on Saturday, April 11, 2020, entered Marie's apartment, shocked her with a stun gun, and inflicted more than 12 knife wounds on her. At the time when the woman was already dead, the young man, taking advantage of her apartment, calmly took a shower, drank beer and a protein cocktail, started messaging a woman he recently met, sending her photos from the apartment, boasting that he lives in a luxurious flat he recently acquired. He then went to the hardware store where he bought tarpaulin and rope, and upon returning to the apartment, continued drinking beer and cocktails throughout the night. When Wayne entered his sister's apartment the next morning and saw Luke and what he had done, a brutal fight ensued between the men, which ended as tragically for Wayne as it did for his sister. As a result of this altercation, Wayne Johnson suffered 25 knife wounds, including in the head, chest, and abdomen. Realizing that Luke had received several knife wounds and a dislocated collarbone during the fight, Wayne asked his grandmother to take him to the hospital, lying about the circumstances leading to the injury. While Luke stood in the corridor, calling his grandmother, and then waited for her, crying and mumbling in pain, a neighbor took a photo of the suspicious guy. Prosecutor Justin Wally presented evidence that Luke, proficient in computers, attempted to access Marie's bank accounts through her computer while in the apartment, and this, along with the desire to take possession of her flat, served as the motive for the murder. Wayne Johnson, on the other hand, became a random victim as he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, merely intending to visit his sister. Forensic psychiatric examination declared Luke Fawcett mentally competent, although his brazen and provocative behavior in the apartment, drinking beer and cocktails while Marie Collins lay dead on the floor wrapped in tarpaulin, remains inexplicable. In September 2021, the jury that rejected Luke Fawcett's claims found him guilty of the double murder of Marie Collins and Wayne Johnson after a 30-minute deliberation. Before sentencing, Prosecutor Justin Wally stated that Fawcett displayed callous indifference at the highest level and the highest degree of depravity that defies adequate description. As a result, Fawcett was sentenced to 2 life terms with a minimum of 34 years before he becomes eligible for parole, potentially reaching the age of 61 by that time. After the trial, Helen Batina, the sister of the victims who discovered their bodies,
read a statement on behalf of the family. The statement expressed that, despite justice prevailing, it wouldn't bring back their two loved ones and wouldn't erase the pain and suffering they endured since the Easter weekend of 2020. She also mentioned that the 22 months of investigation and court proceedings felt like the family's worst nightmare and would never end, as the empty chairs at the family table will always be a constant reminder of the absence of beloved family members and the nightmare they had to endure. In turn, Fawcett's grandparents, Heather and Philip Rogers, who were also present during the sentencing, stated that over the last 2 years, they rarely communicated with their grandson and had no idea where he had been and what he was doing. The heinous murder he committed shocked them, and they said, "What he did is just unbelievable. None of us can understand it." Despite this, we will support Luke because he still remains a member of our family.